Section 9 of The Shadowy Thing by H.B. Drake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3. Olave. Chapter 1. This isn't a war story, and I don't intend to say anything about my life as a soldier. But the thing happened, all the same, and though even a mere summary of my doings would be clean out of the course of my narrative, yet without the war my tale would not have been what it is. In fact, I think it would have ended with Avery's second defeat, because I don't believe the fellow had any intention of renewing a conflict where he had already been twice worsted, especially as he'd had the whole world before him if he wanted to find an easier victim. Though, of course, if he had found a victim and worked his will upon the wretch, he would have had an ally to second him if he had wished to break another lance against Blanche. And what the result of such a struggle would have been, I don't intend even to try and imagine. But if I were to take Blanche's view of the thing, it would have been something altogether beyond what I had already seen. Still, that's only Blanche's view. I don't know how far I put faith in her extravagant hypotheses. Her talk of being possessed by spirits and all her communicating with the dead are beyond me. I don't even pretend to understand them. Certainly Avery had a knack of undermining one's nerve and driving one into an evil kind of madness, and I believe if I had been tied to his company for a few weeks, I should have gone as mad as ever Gaveston or Katrina did. And then, too, I must confess, he had an unholy power over animals. But what it all amounted to I never pretended to know, and even now I haven't any settled theory of the thing. I can only tell the story according to the actual facts. The explanation, if indeed there be one, must shift for itself. And then, in any case, it isn't worthwhile bothering about what might have happened, because as a matter of history the war did break out, and the things that I am going to relate did occur. The only incident bearing on my story which has anything to do with active service happened during the fourth winter of the war, towards the beginning of the great Ypres offensive. Olave sent for me one day to help him identify some poor smashed beggar who seemed to have been hit by about a dozen shells all at once. He was pretty frightfully mangled and utterly unrecognizable. Though I had become reasonably inured to horrors by now, yet the sight turned my stomach. Olave had a wonderful nerve for this kind of thing. He carefully freed the body of the clotted mud and the torn clothing, to try and find some possible mark of identity, but it was all useless. There were letters in the fellow's pocket, but it was completely impossible to decipher a word of them under the filth that caked them over. And there was an identity disc, too, but that was cut and twisted and gave no information. Even when the roll of the killed and missing was made out, it wasn't possible to fix a name to him for certain, as so many lay out still in no man's land and wouldn't be collected till after the next push. Olave seemed worried over the thing, though I'm afraid I was more callous. After all, I said, there are thousands of others who can't be traced. Yes, said Olave bitterly, missing, believed killed, and suddenly he broke out, "It isn't good enough, Dick." "It's certainly hard luck," I admitted. "You see," he went on, "there'll be people in Blighty wondering what's happened to him. They'll hang on to the belief that he's been taken prisoner, and when the war's over they'll wait and wait for him to come home." Oh, well, I tried to put an end to the pathetic story. I preferred to keep my mind clear of such things. "Sentiment, isn't it?" Olave continued, and suddenly nailed me with, "Suppose it were you, or me." I hadn't anything to say to that. I know I had rather an unpleasant picture in my mind of my own broken body tossed into a nameless grave. Olave broke into the ugly thought, "We must find some better means, Dick." Then I had a bright inspiration. It was that very morning that I had seen a fellow amusing himself in the trenches, tattooing his hand. "Wait," I said, and went to find him. He was busy with his dinner, as it happened. He said he hadn't got much in the way of paints and tools with him, but he could manage to do something simple. I went back to Olave and told him of my idea. "I've seen fellows," I said, "with a whole fox hunt on their backs." Olave smiled. "That should be fairly obvious," he said. "For myself," I went on, "I should think a pair of crossed oars might do. What about you?" To tell the truth, I was rather taken with the idea of the thing. Olave wasn't so enthusiastic. "It mightn't help very much," he said. "It would be something, though," I answered. "Well," he said, "I'll see the man." "And what's the sign to be?" I asked. What he answered me was for a long time a perplexing puzzle. That he did answer me I felt certain, and as I lay tossing, for how long I don't know, in a feverish delirium, I seemed to be fumbling about in my mind for what Olave had said. For it was just then that a shell caught the dugout, and nothing had any meaning for me till some weeks later, when I began to come back to some sort of dazed realization of where I was and what had happened. That slow returning to consciousness was a miserable business. I chafed at the dull confusion of thoughts and memories that seemed to be tangled hopelessly in my mind. There was nothing clear, nothing to cling to. I knew that there were heaps of questions I wanted to ask, and one particularly, but I couldn't frame them. All I could say was, "Where am I?" I was told to lie quiet, and promptly turned over angrily on my side and let out a wild curse that so startled me that I broke into a stupid giggling. But I remember how one day the question suddenly came to me. I leapt up in bed and cried, "Where's Olave?" I think there was a bit of a scene, because I have a sort of recollection of fighting half a dozen people who seemed to me to be keeping me away from Olave. I called them murderers and other things that don't look well on paper, and I knew what I was doing. That was the queer part of the business, and yet I couldn't help myself. I was frightfully aware that they had taken me from Olave and had him in some terrible dungeon where he was being slowly tortured to death. I tried to be reasonable. "Look here," I said, "you can do what you want with me, but tell me, where's Olave?" "She's well enough," somebody said. "She!" I cried, and burst into an uproarious guffaw. "Oh, you fool!" I shouted. "You prize idiotic fool! I don't remember anything in my waking life that amused me half so much as that little misunderstanding." I don't know exactly how long after this it was that Blanche seemed to appear from nowhere. I suppose I had been moved to England at last. Somehow I became almost immediately myself again, and learnt that Olave was well enough. "They've let him out, have they?" I asked. Blanche seemed to understand quite well what I was talking about. "Oh, yes," she said. "Didn't you know?" That seemed to clear my head. I looked at Blanche with a sudden fear at my heart that I had been making a monstrous fool of myself. "I say, Blanche," I said, "have I been saying things?" "They won't be brought in evidence against you," she smiled back. "Good Lord," I muttered, with a sort of dim memory of shouted oaths and curses echoing in my mind. "Dick," Blanche said, taking my face between her hands, "shall I tell you something to comfort you?" "Do," I replied. "Well," she went on, "it's a good sign of character to say bad things in delirium." I laughed. "I don't understand that," I said. "And I don't intend to enlighten you," she retorted. I took it that she was either trying to set my mind at ease, or else it was merely another of her mad ideas. But it was good to know that Olave was still unhurt. Yet it was better to be master once again of one's faculties, and it was a glad day for me when I was able to return to Chalk Ridge, especially as I was told I should be fit in a few months to join my battalion again. And about this time the Ypres offensive came to a halt. Chapter 2. I found a letter from Olave waiting for me when I got home. He had heard from Blanche that I was to be discharged from hospital, and had written to congratulate me on my recovery. "It's constitution that does it," he wrote. That made me smile, and I determined to show it to Blanche as an example of Olave's heresy, for Blanche would have put it down to will. I was expecting Blanche the next day. She was to bring Katrina and Ursuline with her to spend a few days at Chalk Ridge. She said she knew that otherwise I should be dashing over to Hinton Hall before I was fit. I pictured to myself a little debate on constitution versus will. I should quote Olave as my authority, and myself as a case in point. This passed through my mind quickly as I glanced through the letter, but the amusing fancy was whisked right away when I came to an unexpected mention of Avery. It was the first I had heard of him during the war. Olave had seen him. I looked back to the date of the letter. It was 3 days before the end of the offensive, which the morning paper said had now won its objective. All the old evil associations that had gathered in my mind about the name of Avery came crowding back into my consciousness, and for a while I read the letter without understanding a word. I turned back to the first mention of him and studied the thing more carefully. "I just got a glimpse of him," Olave wrote, "but it was unmistakable. I don't think he saw me. But then you never know how much a fellow like that has seen. His eyes seemed to sweep past me like a dark searchlight, if you can imagine such a thing. A black gleam, and they had gone. He's a colonel, full rank too, and seems to be a fellow of some importance. Red tabs and so forth. From what I can gather, he's got some devilish invention he wants to try. He's been fixing up something in no-man's land half the morning. By the way, if this letter gets opened, I shall get into a fine row. I must do him justice and say a word for his pluck. I think the Boche have got an idea that there's something unpleasant hatching out in the mud there, and they've been dropping things all about him for some while now. It was the same yesterday, but he doesn't seem to trouble about that kind of thing. Perhaps he's immune from shell fire, under the special protection of heaven. Of hell, I commented to myself. The letter went on. We attack tomorrow morning, for the last time, I hope. And knowing what I do, I'm pretty thankful that Avery's for us and not against us. I shouldn't like to come up against some unexpected devilry of his in the middle of no-man's land. All this set me musing, and I wondered whether, after all, I would mention Olave's letter to Blanche. I didn't like to think of the possibility of his meeting with Avery out there where so many things might happen, with never a witness to tell of them. I was uneasy, and felt I shouldn't rest happily till I had heard again from Olave to say he was well out of the battle. I read his postscript twice before I realized what I was reading. "I've followed your suggestion," he wrote, "and had that tattooing done. Only just lately, though. There didn't seem to be time before." That sent my thoughts racing back to that last talk with Olave. What was it he had said when that shell came? Still, I couldn't get my memory on the track of the thing. I answered Olave's letter, promising him more when I had seen Ursellen and Blanche, and I asked him to let me know what sign he had had tattooed upon him. And the next day I was to see Katrina again. Naturally, I had seen little enough of her during the war. This was my first long spell in England after the first training was over, and that hadn't taken very long. I had seen her in snatches during my scanty leaves home, but it was seldom enough that I had been able to get on to the theme which alone interested me. Abroad, of course, it had been so easy, even for an unimaginative fellow like myself, to picture wonderful homecomings and delicious confessions in the moonlight. But actually faced with Katrina, I found it quite another matter. There was a barrier of reserve between us. Words didn't come easily, and again I found myself outward bound with nothing said. I couldn't make out whether she were deliberately heading me off the forbidden subject, or whether it was merely my own hesitant awkwardness that stood in the way. For her behavior was puzzling. Certainly she wasn't happy, yet I couldn't persuade myself that she was hungering for me to speak. But during my last leave, I had managed to come to a clearer knowledge of her heart. Perhaps it was that she had been franker with me, and altogether more like her old self, as I had known her in the days of the golden girlish plait and the leaping hounds. Also, I think I took heart from seeing her eyes clear again of the last trace of leaden storm which had dulled their beautiful blue. For indeed, it wasn't till the summer of this year, 3 long years after the disappearance of Avery, that Katrina really became herself again. The shadow of harassing care that had gloomed her brow so long had gone. I returned to find her almost as I had known her first, except that she had become somewhat more grave and serious, and that was only natural, seeing in what days we lived, not to mention her daily companionship with Blanche. Seeing her restored and clearly delighted to meet me again, I took heart to speak to her. And yet it wasn't till the last day that I managed to say what I wished. For now it was her gaiety which hedged me from her, as before it had been her sad reserve. When I tried to bring her down to a serious facing of our situation, she laughed me away from it, or, if there were no other escape for her, she would defend herself behind Ursellen, racing the little toddler away for a game. I would find them hidden behind a bush, and Katrina would say very solemnly, "Here's Uncle Dick with the big eyes," and Ursellen would scream with laughter, though just where the joke lay I couldn't make out. Still, in the face of such odds, it was impossible to press my purpose. I caught her at last, though, in an unguarded moment. I plunged without warning. "Why do you run away from me, Katrina?" I asked. She didn't pretend to misunderstand me. "Because it's safer," she said. "Well, you've got to stand and fight now," I declared. She looked at me quite steadily and said, "I had quite intended to, Dick, at the right time, but it might have spoilt your holiday earlier." "You had quite intended to?" I repeated her. "You mean you intend to fight me?" She gave me a look of inexpressible tenderness. "Oh, can't you see," she cried, on a note of wonderful appeal, "that I'd surrender if I could? Unconditionally," she threw in. I suppose I ought to have been content with that. I couldn't have hoped for a more naked expression of her love for me. But somehow I was chafed by the continual thwartings I had been forced to submit to, and I refused to be appeased. "You can surrender," was all I said. "I wish you'd show me how," she answered, with a tone of weariness in her voice. She dropped listlessly into a seat, and at once I was on my knees before her. Her words had blown my smouldering annoyance to a flame of longing. I caught her by the wrists and pleaded with her in a way altogether unworthy, not only of her, but of my own love for her. I babbled easily of divorce and so forth, as though marriage were merely the chance partnership of a dance. She could throw Avery off as one might discard a servant, and wed me instead. I can see now that I was just carried away by my own selfish desire. There wasn't a consideration in all my heart for Katrina's own feelings in the matter. I suppose I assumed that she yearned for me with the same abandonment of desire with which I yearned for her. And so, for the moment, I really saw nothing dishonorable or degrading in what I pressed so ardently upon her. She heard me to an end, without an interruption. She didn't even draw her wrists free. But when I had finished, she looked very sadly into my eyes and said, "I wish you hadn't spoken like that, Dick." "But, Katrina," I continued blindly, "we love each other. What other bond is there so sacred?" "One's word, Dick," she replied. That steadied me somewhat, but I went on. "But if the word was forced upon you—" "If," she repeated. I realized then that I had come no nearer my end than I had 3 years before. I rose and said rather sulkily, "Yet you love me." At that she rose too, and was suddenly crushed against my breast, and it was her lips that sought mine in a pressure of passion. She drew away from me slowly, and looking at me with pleading in her eyes, said, "You wouldn't want me to say more than that, would you, Dick?" She seemed to be waiting for the answer as though great issues depended on it. I felt utterly shamed, and could scarcely murmur a word. I turned away, muttering, "I'm frightfully sorry, Katrina. You must forgive me." She caught me by the arm and held me back. "Dick," she said very decidedly, "there's nothing to forgive. Please believe that. You mustn't think I don't prize your love. I prize it more than I can say. But, you see, it's too good to spoil." I just crushed her hand and let it drop. I had nothing to say. "But isn't it?" she pressed me. At that I cried out, "All I know is you're too good for me, Katrina. I'd better take myself off." "Not like that, you old stupid," she exclaimed, and once again we embraced. "There," she said, "now it's all clear, isn't it?" "Except the end," I answered. "Ah," she said sharply, and a little shudder seemed to shake her, and I thought I caught again the trailing edge of cloud darkening in her eyes. But I had no time to undo what I had done, for Blanche had come upon us, and with nothing further said of any consequence, I had gone back to France. Well, it was with the memory of all this in my mind that I awaited Katrina's coming. I knew now that I had behaved shabbily. I had drawn the girl to an exposure of herself which wasn't so much a gratification to my vanity as a condemnation of my selfishness. I couldn't help feeling elated at her more than frank confession of her love, but so completely had she abandoned herself to me that I felt ashamed that only so could my selfish hankering for her be appeased. Yet so beautiful had her yielding been that it served to place her the higher in my adoration, while it sunk my own respect for myself lower than I cared to confess. So it was with a fine sense of upright resolution and chivalrous purpose that I looked to meeting her again and setting all straight between us. Chapter 3. She came with the morning, but it wasn't till the afternoon that I found myself alone with her. She seemed delighted to be back once more at Chalk Ridge, and trotted me from room to room, refreshing her memory of every little nook and corner. "And you know," she said gaily, "there's not a thing been changed for 4 years. You see, I've been away," I explained, "and everything's been kept in order for the return of my lord." She bopped me a curtsy. "Ah, well," I laughed, "I'm a rare old conservative, and they know my habits." "And when a thing isn't just where it ought to be, somebody gets a scolding," she said. "Usually," I admitted. She looked at me saucily for a moment and broke into a bright peal of laughter. Then, turning to Blanche, she said, "Is he such a frightful tyrant, really?" Blanche looked very solemn and said, "He mustn't be crossed, you know." I believe they had got some little joke to themselves which I didn't quite tumble to. It was after lunch that Katrina said, "I've inspected everything indoors and find it quite in order. So now you must take me out, Dick, and show me round all the old rambles." "Right," I consented, "and I don't suppose you'll find anything changed there, either." Blanche elected to stay at home. It may have been from consideration to me, or the reason she gave may have been the truth. She said she must attend to Ursellan. Why he needed any attention I don't know, because he seemed to sleep for the better part of the afternoon, but Blanche wasn't an ordinary mother. She had ideas as to her duties, and seemed to have precious little time to give to anyone or anything if it meant her being separated from Ursellan. Well, I didn't attempt to dissuade her. The prospect of a walk and talk with Katrina was too good to be resisted. We said little enough for some while. Katrina seemed to be enjoying herself immensely, though she merely expressed her satisfaction by her buoyant stepping and alert attention to everything about her. Now and again she would just say, "Ah, here it is," or "the same old spot," and I was content to let her enjoy her thoughts in silence, without needless comments from me. I was only too glad to feel that the place had such a hold on her affections, though it was bitter to know that if all had gone as it should have done, she wouldn't have been tramping at my side as a stranger. It was with a slight sense of dismay that I realized she was heading for Seven Elms Meadow, for I had thrown the reins of leadership into her hands. I tried to steer her away, but she understood my action and said, "No, let's go there, Dick." She added after a little pause and in a more serious tone, "You see, it doesn't matter now that I've got well over all that nonsense." I looked at her quickly, repeating, "Got over it? Nonsense?" We stepped on together for a few minutes without a word said. In fact, it wasn't until we were leaning over the stile where we had once surveyed the bull that Katrina spoke again. She said slowly, "Dick, I thought we had cleared things up, but we hadn't. It would be better if we could be quite frank, wouldn't it?" She turned her face full on mine as she spoke. "Katrina," I blurted out, "there's a lot I've been wanting to say. I behaved like a cad last time." "Stop," she said sharply. She gave me her hand and went on. "You mustn't say things like that. I just won't listen." I tried to interrupt her, but she shook her head. "No, I tell you, I won't listen. It's I who have behaved badly, Dick." "You?" I protested. "I want you to know everything," she continued, and looking up at me with trouble in her eyes, she repeated, "Oh, Dick, I want you to know everything." She seemed to be waiting for me to give her permission to speak. "Katrina," I said, hesitatingly, "of course you can tell me anything you'd like to, but I think I know all I want to know. You love me. You've told me that." "I forced you to." "Brutally." "No, no, no," she cried. "You didn't force me. Besides, I think I had told you that before." She smiled up at me wonderfully and added, "And I'll tell you again and again, just as often as you want me to." We kissed each other. "There's nothing to be ashamed of in that," she said gravely, "but it's something else that I want to tell you. It's Then it came out with a sudden cry. "It's that I haven't been true to my love for you. I let Avery come between. Because you know, Dick, I had loved you long before I met Avery. But I did love him, Dick. That's what I wanted to confess to you. I've been afraid before. I've just sort of hinted at it. But I loved him, Dick. Really loved him, I mean. I want you to understand that, because it may change your feeling towards me." I spoke her name, but she ran on in the same troubled voice. Let me finish. I shall feel easier. You see, there was something about him, different, you know, his eyes. And then music seems to float me right away. If I had never met you, Dick, I could have followed him gladly to the ends of the earth." She gave a deep sigh and ended softly, "Now you know." For a moment I didn't quite know how to tell her how completely unchanged her confession had left me. I began to stutter a few words, and then blurted out, "I don't care, Katrina. I don't care a snap of the fingers. It's so utterly clear to me that the fellow practiced his infernal tricks on you, just as he has done on others." "No, no," she said wearily. "Yes," I insisted. "I know. I was at school with him. I've seen some of his handiwork. He just victimized you. Surely you must realize that by now." "Yes, after he got me into his power," she said. "But you see, it was my own fault that he ever got me into his power. I was willing to go." "Yet you wouldn't have gone if I hadn't failed you that night," I said. "That was just a last feeble flutter of resistance," she replied sadly. "If you had come, I should have gone with you. But even so, it was my own fault. I think I let myself get rather angry with you for not coming. You see, you didn't say what was keeping you away, and I believe I could have resisted, but I didn't really want to." "Well, I just don't believe it," I declared. "I've been under Avery's spell myself. He makes you think you're doing something you're wanting to do, and all the time you're just obeying him. I know, though he's never actually caught me out. And then the way he treated you after he got you." "Yes," she cut me short with a sudden cry, and her face hardened strangely. "Yes, now, of course, my eyes are opened. I know him for what he is. I'm his wife. I can't forget that. But I shall never be his victim again. And yet," her face softened, "I still believe there are possibilities of good in him." "Don't believe it," I broke in. "It's just there that he finds the weak spot where he can strike. He caught Blanche the same way. Others, too, I don't doubt. He's just utter black through and through. But it's no use calling him names. The ordinary sort of thing doesn't apply to him. He needs a vocabulary to himself." After that there was a long pause, while I chewed savagely at the thought that such a man should be allowed to touch and stain the life of such a girl as Katrina. "Well, then, you see how it is," Katrina said at last. For a moment my old weakness was upon me, and I said, "But, Katrina, do you mean that you intend to stand by him to the last? Are we to let him come between us, for all our lives, it may be? It's simply preposterous." I had caught her by the hands, and was speaking with a passion. She steadied me with a look. "I'm sorry," I said. "I won't trouble you again. But it's frightfully difficult. It just makes a ruin of our whole lives." "It does," she said. "Things happen like that sometimes. I can't think why." We turned away without another word spoken. I thought at that moment that it would be good to be back in the firing line again, with death busy in the air. I had always hoped that when Katrina had quite fought down her madness, she would immediately set herself to win back her freedom. That had seemed to me the obvious thing to do. Even Olave had assumed that she would do so. It wasn't until I had begun to find her averse to it that it had occurred to me that perhaps there was something in such a course repulsive to a girl of her nature and upbringing. Now, of course, it was painfully clear to me that she wouldn't contemplate the thing for a moment. Her vow remained sacred, even though it might have been won from her by guile. She was evidently obsessed with the idea that she had gone to Avery of her own free will, and had merely discovered too late what kind of man he really was. If I wished to persuade her to sue for a divorce, I would first have to get that idea out of her head. But as a matter of fact, I respected her scruples too much to try and argue against them. It was only in moments of sudden passion that I had pleaded with her to take the dishonorable course, and I had repented of such moments. Even now, When I thought I had quite steeled myself to the inevitable, my weakness had found me out. It was only Katrina's own straight directness of purpose which made it possible for her to treat me as a lover, and yet never overstep the line she had set between us. It was with some such thoughts as these beating in my mind, with a feeling of exultation struggling with a hopeless bitterness of disappointment, that I walked on with Katrina, speechless for the most part, and at length, with the falling of the early winter twilight, turned back home. Nearing the house, I saw someone approaching us through the dusk. It was a messenger, one of Olave's men. He was in motoring gear, and in his hand he held a little paper. He brought it to Katrina, saying to me, "Mrs. Guthrie told me to bring it straight out here, sir. She said I should meet you." "You're from Hinton Hall?" I said. "Just come, sir," he answered. "I had orders to bring anything along that looked urgent. It's from the War Office." At that I turned sharply to Katrina. She was gazing at me, but what her eyes were saying I couldn't read in the dusky light. She held the paper out to me. I read it, dazedly, rubbing my eyes. At last I got the meaning clear. Avery had been killed in action. For an age, it seemed, we stood there without a word, gazing at each other. "Of course it isn't true," I said at last. It seemed too silly for words, and yet, with the memory of Olave's letter in my mind, I knew there was nothing more likely. But the thought I had was that a fellow like Avery didn't get killed. It seemed too simple an ending to such a story as he had already made of his life. "It's true, Dick," said Katrina. I tried to read her meaning in her expression, but it baffled me. I wanted to crush her in my arms. There was such a leaping gladness at my heart, but something in her voice restrained me. The messenger said, "Do you want me, sir?" I had forgotten him. "No," I said, "no," and he went. That brought me back to reality again. Avery was dead. I read the official notice once more. This sort of thing could be trusted. The shadow had gone. The burden had fallen away. Again I looked at Katrina, with the yearning at my soul straining mightily towards her. She said simply, "It's my husband who's dead." Then I knew why I mustn't break into a shout of triumph. "I shall ask you to come to me some day," she went on. "You'll come, won't you, Dick?" I just said, "Yes, Katrina." We went quietly into the house. I wanted to tell Blanche the news. She wasn't about. I was rather glad, because I thought I should like to tell her with no one to witness the exultation which I knew I couldn't keep out of my voice. I went to her room and knocked. After a moment's waiting I knocked again, and presently she opened the door to me. "Avery's been killed," I said, holding out the note. She took it, but didn't read it. She was looking at me strangely. "Come in," she whispered at length, "quietly." There was no expression in her voice. She tiptoed to Ursulline's bedside. The little fellow lay sleeping, with his hands thrown carelessly across the coverlet. His lips were pouted to an adorable prettiness, so that I could have caught him up and kissed him like a very girl. "Isn't he beautiful?" said Blanche, again in that expressionless whisper. Strangely startled, I turned to her and muttered, "Why, whatever's the matter?" She drew herself up very straight and slowly handed me a paper. It was the counterpart of the one I had just shown her. In a terrible alarm I took it from her, but I didn't dare look at it. "Good God!" I whispered. "Don't say—" but I couldn't shape the words. At length I turned to the fatal note in my hand. Stupidly I read, "Missing. Believed killed." I knew those weren't the words I could see, but they were the ones that forced themselves into my mind. I could hear Olave speaking them as he had done in the dugout. I strained at the paper through an obscuring mist, but couldn't get the thing clear. But after all, what did it matter? The meaning was all too plain. "Olave," I said faintly. Blanche fell on her knees by the little cot and sobbed against the pillow. Ursulline opened wide eyes, and with a mischievous chuckle thrust his fat little fingers into her hair. Chapter 4. My convalescence dragged on miserably enough. There was nothing to make me want to linger in England. For the time I knew Katrina had gone right out of my life, and I felt that it wouldn't be for a good while yet that she would call me back to her. I had an idea that she would wait till the war ended, if it ever did end, and perhaps she had set some limit in her own mind, a year it might be. But meanwhile there was the tedious interim to fill as best I might. And yet it wasn't the prospect of a weary waiting that made me chafe to be in action again. It was rather the fretting uncertainty with regard to Olave. I searched the casualty lists day after day, but after the first notice of his being missing, I came upon no further reference to him. It was some consolation to see Avery's name gazetted among the dead, and yet somehow I half expected to find that the thing was a mistake, and feared every day that it might be denied. Of course I wrote to my colonel and to my chums in the field, asking for any particulars they could furnish, but it didn't help very much. If anything, it convinced me in my own mind, though I wouldn't confess it to Blanche, nor yet to myself consciously, that Olave was dead. The actual facts I could get hold of were slight enough. The colonel told me something about Avery. He had messed with him the night before the attack. Queer fellow, the letter described him, and went on into a rambling yarn of Avery making some poor dazed Boche outpost leave his funk-hole and come wandering across to the English lines. Evidently Avery had done the thing to amuse the mess. The colonel said he thought he must be some kind of conjurer. In any case, he had had a pretty good mine ready for the Boche, and a nice little scheme to trap them. But something had gone wrong somewhere. The letter described Avery in the hell of a rage about it. He had gone rushing out to set things right, but the Boche had charged and had captured his little emplacement. Olave had led the counterattack and had cleared the position in fine style. But then something had happened. Nobody knew quite what. All the world seemed to be in the air. Deuce of a gaff, said the letter. And when later the English attack had passed beyond, there was a fine tangle of dead and wounded. Avery had been killed outright. Later, in answer to another letter of mine, the colonel said there could be no possible doubt about it. Half his head was blown away, the letter said. You needn't hold out any hopes to the widow if that's your trouble. The colonel didn't know how his bluff statement rejoiced me. I didn't want to hold out any hopes to the widow. And here was just the thing I desired, half his head. I remember Blanche telling me that I should have shot him through the head. The only doubt that still persisted in my mind was that perhaps, after all, this wasn't Avery. There might have been some coincidence in the names, merely. Yet, when I read again the various letters I had received from my chums, and from the colonel, too, there seemed absolutely no reason for such a doubt. The single story of the Boche outpost should have been enough to reassure me, even if there hadn't been 50 other details in the various descriptions of him to set my mind at rest. This was Avery right enough, I kept telling myself, and he was dead all right. But still the doubt wouldn't be argued away. I suppose it seemed too silly that the thing should end so easily. The death didn't correspond to the life. Avery, I felt, would make more of a stir before he let himself be whisked out of the world like that. And yet the facts were all in my favor, and Katrina had received official notice of his death. Strangely enough, where there was room for doubt, I felt none. There had been a number of unrecognizable bodies found after the explosion. In fact, the bodies couldn't be numbered correctly, because they had been scattered in fragments impossible to sort. And then, too, the wounded had been cleared before a proper count had been made, and even some of the wounded had been unrecognizable at first, and had gone down the line without a number or a name. So there was always the hope that Olave might be living, but at present too badly wounded to identify. But somehow I couldn't think it was so. I felt strangely certain that Olave was among those others who had been left unknown on the field. And stupidly enough my mind went back to the motor smash and the mangled body of old Jock. I could hear Olave saying, "If I were mauled like that, I hope I should have the decency to die outright." I remembered how perturbed he had been that evening, and I couldn't shake myself free of the thought that he had felt some dark presentiment of his own fate. I even had the fantastic picture of him in my imagination, proudly wrenching himself free from his shattered but still living body, leaving it to lie there a forsaken derelict. And yet I couldn't help beating back in my mind for the memory of what Olave had said to me just before I had received my own packet. What was the mark which was to distinguish him? I mentioned the matter in my letters abroad, but it didn't help at all. Somebody remembered something about it, but not what the actual sign was, nor where on his body it had been tattooed. And the man who had done the thing had been killed. I fretted myself into a fine fume about it. This might be just the one detail that was wanted. Meanwhile, Olave had either been buried in an unknown grave, or was lying in some hospital without a name of his own. And suddenly the memory came to me of his own grave at Hinton Chapel. Would he be the first of the Guthries, I asked myself, to fail at the last tryst? All this bothered me more than I cared to own, and perhaps hindered my convalescence. And even when I managed to tear my thoughts from the puzzle, there was still a dull pain at my heart for Blanche's sorrow. She bore up wonderfully, though I think she had no more hope than I had myself. "I must remember I am his wife," she would say proudly, when I knew she was on the verge of breakdown. But sometimes she was unable to repress the grief, and would cry brokenly, "If only I could be certain! This suspense is horrible." She came to see me, for with Katrina's band between us I didn't dare visit Hinton Hall, and I think I learnt to admire Blanche during those few months of terrible uncertainty more than I had ever done before. Her strange battling with Avery had passed beyond my comprehension. I had only been able to guess dimly what strain of nerve and steadiness of purpose it had entailed. But here was a human grief that I could quite well estimate. I had known something of the same sort of thing when Katrina had been carried off by Avery, and watching the girl in her trouble, I knew she was superb. For the rest, I never learnt full particulars of the stunt that Avery had been engaged in on that fatal morning. As a matter of fact, nobody could tell me much about it. It was assumed that there had been some sort of mine because of the frightful explosion that had resulted. But the colonel hinted that there were other things behind it, if only one could get at the heart of the mystery. "There was some kind of electrical outfit," he wrote. "He tried it on me. Very weak, he said, but I went deuced dizzy. I reckon he had got the trump card there if things hadn't gone wrong, but it's a queer business altogether. Queer fellow, too. Sort of conjurer, I should say." And I never learnt any more than that, though I felt pretty certain, knowing my man, that the Boche had escaped lightly, and we had lost an instrument of war which might have smoothed out our path in many an unpleasant corner. I missed all the immense battles of the German offensive, but I was back in France in time for the great last act. It was shortly before I left that Blanche visited me. She was obviously troubled at something, and, contrary to custom, she hadn't brought Ursellen with her. I was afraid to ask her what the matter was, for I thought I could guess. And yet the shadow in her eyes didn't seem to me to be mere grief. If Olave were dead, after all, I wouldn't have pictured her looking like that. So I waited for her to speak, not caring to put the blunt question, "Have you heard anything?" though, as a matter of fact, I didn't think she could have done, because I had scanned the papers pretty carefully and hadn't come across any further mention of either Olave or Avery. "When you get back, Dick," she opened the subject, "I want you to make very careful inquiries." She broke off. I waited a moment and asked, "What about?" "There's something I can't understand," she said. "It's about Avery." "Good God," I cried, "don't say he's still alive." "I want you to find out his grave," she said, "and, as I say, make very careful inquiries." She handed me a paper. "Here are the official War Office particulars," she said. I glanced at the name of the cemetery. I knew the place. It was between Ypres and Poperinghe. "Right, if I can get there," I promised. "But what's the trouble?" "That's just what I don't know," she replied. "You're not very explicit," I prompted her. "Sorry, Dick, but I can't be," she answered with a faint smile. "You're afraid he isn't dead after all," I pressed her. "Perhaps," she admitted, "but I can't understand." "Look here," I cried, "this is horrible. For God's sake, tell me what's troubling you." Why don't you think he's dead?" She didn't answer me for a moment, but passed her hand slowly over her brow in a way I knew from of old. I noticed then that she looked fagged out. I told myself she had been up to her old games. "I suppose you've been seeing Mrs. Waite lately?" I said, rather roughly. "Certainly, Dick, I have," she answered me steadily. "Ah!" I exclaimed. "You see, that's why it's so difficult for me to tell you anything," she went on. "You don't believe in these things." "No," I said, "I don't." She smiled with faint amusement and said, "You seem to forget the hut in the mountains. However," she went on rapidly, as I started at the reference, "we'd better keep off debatable ground. All I can say is that there's something very funny about the whole thing. Frankly, I can't find out whether Avery is dead or not," she added quietly, "nor Olave." "If it helps you at all," I said, "I can tell you that Avery most certainly had half his head blown away. I've made very exact inquiries on my own account. You can have the letters if you like." "Thanks, Dick," she replied quickly. "I should like to see them." I hesitated, remembering there were things about Olave in them. She might get the idea into her head that he had been horribly mangled and disfigured, and had been tossed into some unknown hole. "There are things you mightn't like to read," I suggested. "Oh, I want to know everything," she cried. "Let me have them, Dick." I unearthed the packet and gave them to her. She began running them through quickly, and I left her at the task. When I returned, I found her deep in a reverie, with the letters fallen to the floor. "Any clearer?" I asked, stooping to pick them up. She seemed to come back slowly from very far away. "I don't quite know," she answered at length. "I think I begin to see. I'll let you hear later. Although you are such an unbeliever," she added, with that faint smile which had before played wanly about her lips and eyes. And the next day I crossed over once again, and was soon with my battalion, and forgot all the doubts and anxieties that had troubled me in England, because life was very full in these days, and there was no room in one's head for anything except the urgent matter of the moment. It was later, when the war was over, and we lay idly at rest, that the old problems came back to me, and once more I found myself fretting over the disappearance of Olave, and Blanche's dark hints that perhaps Avery was still alive. At the first opportunity I beat back on my tracks to Ypres, and soon found the cemetery. It was a more difficult matter finding the grave in that little forest of wooden crosses, but I tracked it down by the date, and at length I stood before it. If faith were to be put in names and inscriptions, here was Avery's grave for a certainty. "Colonel Avery Booth," I read, "Royal Engineers." I studied the name letter by letter, as though half expecting to see them change before my eyes, but there was no possibility of mistaking it. It was as clear as daylight. How long I stood there I don't know, but suddenly the thought came to me that, after all, this told me no more than the official announcement of his death, and not nearly so much as the accounts I had had of him in the various letters I had received. If I could dig up the earth and examine the body that lay buried there, I might be able to settle my doubts, but there was nothing in a mere name to prove that there hadn't been a mistake. Unsatisfied, I turned away. I noticed a pioneer at work a few graves off. Idly I strolled up to him, and he straightened a bent back and saluted me. I wondered if he could tell me anything. At length I asked him if there were any records of the burials to be seen. He scratched his head and said he didn't rightly know. He directed me to the officer in charge. But he looked as though he would like a good gossip, and I thought I might learn something useful. "If there's anything I could tell you, sir," he suggested, with an obvious desire to yarn. Well, I let him yarn, and eventually asked if he remembered Colonel Booth, who had been buried there. He seemed to have some hazy recollection of the name. I took him to the grave, and memory came back to him in a flood. "Ah!" he cried, "red tabs. Yes, sir, I remember burying him all right. Sold him up neat, sir. Brother? Cousin?" He looked up at me inquisitively. I gathered that he was rather proud of having had the burying of a staff colonel. No wonder the thing lived in his memory. But though I questioned him pretty closely, I couldn't get anything more out of him. He seemed to want to impress me that everything had been done handsomely for the staff colonel. Evidently he took me for a relative, and thought he might get a fat tip. The idea amused me, and I played up to it. "Yet you don't seem to have done much for him since you buried him," I said, pointing out the unweeded and flowerless grave, which by contrast to the graves around looked more desolate than if it had been alone by the wayside, for it was clear that the cemetery was well kept for the most part, nearly all the graves showing some tribute of autumn flowers, though now the frosts were beginning to get them. But Avery's grave seemed utterly neglected. Even the few weeds that grew there looked shriveled and withered. The fellow began shaking his head, and exclaimed, "Yes, sir, that's so, sir, but it's not my fault, sir. It's the women does it all, sir. They come from the village, 3 or 4 of them, and stick in these here flowers. I does the weeding as a rule, but they say they won't grow here, sir. I've told them—" "What do you say?" I cried. "I say I've told them hundreds of times," he began. "No, about the flowers," I cut in. "About them not growing?" he asked. "Truth, sir, though you mightn't believe it. You ask them." He pointed to a group of women in a far corner of the cemetery, and then began whistling and shouting to them. "You just ask them," he repeated. "Truth, sir." I took his insistence to mean that he was afraid the tip wouldn't be forthcoming if he couldn't prove his point, and still he called and waved to the women till a couple of them eventually came over to us. He accosted them vigorously. "Tell the orficer about this here grave. Flowers plenty, all no grow. Vrai, oui?" The sudden burst of clatter from the 2 women was enough to convince me of the truth of the thing. I couldn't make out much of their words. They seemed to be tumbling over themselves to express their utter lack of comprehension of the mystery. They opened their arms wide in token of being completely baffled. Plenty flowers, yes, they had sown, but the officer no bon. They came back to that again and again. With the feeling that there was something unholy about the place, I distributed largesse and turned away. I didn't want to examine any records now. The barren grave in the flowering cemetery seemed to me the strongest proof of what I wanted to know. I refused to listen to the idle chaffing of reason and the insistence of common sense that there was merely something unhealthy about that patch of ground. A gas shell might have fallen there. Anything might account for the coincidence, but contrary to custom, all this was as nothing to me. I felt rooted to the conviction that the thing was only explicable by the evil poison that lay buried beneath. End of section 9. Read by Thomas Copeland. Section 10 of The Shadowy Thing by H.B. Drake. Part 3, Chapter 5. It was in the early months of the next year that I got my discharge, and crossed homeward for the last time. Knowing that I was coming, Katrina sent me the summons I had been longing for. It was simple enough, just, "I should like you to come to me, Dick," written clearly on a folded slip of paper and tucked into a letter from Blanche. So, reaching London, I took train for Little Hinton without deviating by Chalk Ridge. As I had hoped, I was able to come to speech with Blanche before I saw Katrina. Though I had told her of what I had seen and heard at the cemetery, and though the evidence for Avery's death seemed beyond all possible doubt, yet her letters had been unsatisfactory, and in spite of myself I couldn't quite clear my mind of a shadowy uneasiness that persisted in lurking there and refused to be dislodged. And I wanted to know how far I was justified in pressing my suit upon Katrina, while the death of Avery still seemed, to Blanche at any rate, a matter of uncertainty. Also I wanted to know whether Katrina herself had any doubts on the subject. Blanche, in her last letter, had said that she had told Katrina nothing, as there was no need. But quite what Blanche's grounds of suspicion were I didn't know, and, for all I could make out, Katrina might have doubts of her own, irrespective of Blanche. Then, too, I was puzzled at Blanche's saying there was no need to tell Katrina anything. It seemed to me that Avery's being alive or dead concerned Katrina more than anyone else. Blanche had written, "To Katrina he is dead, so you needn't worry, Dick." But that didn't explain anything to me. And again she had said in her elusive way, "He is dead, all right, but he hasn't passed over." But that didn't help either. So I wanted to see her and have the puzzle cleared up before I met Katrina, as otherwise I shouldn't know how I stood with regard to the girl. Blanche drove to the station to meet me, so I was able to have a good talk with her before entering the house. The first thing I noticed was that she was dressed in black. The shock was sharp, for there only seemed to be one possible explanation. She looked very weary and wasted, too, as though she had been watching late at night. I couldn't help blurting out, "Good God, have you heard?" She wrung my hand very hard and turned her face away. It wasn't till the motor had started that she answered me. But her face was serene enough now, and she said, "Yes, I have heard, Dick." I sat speechless. After a pause, she said, "Don't grieve for me, Dick. I know now. It was the suspense I couldn't bear, and I have a great consolation." At that I broke out, "It's all too utterly cruel, Blanche. I can't see what consolation there is, and I can't preach any. I don't see why these things happen." I knew while I was speaking that it was a strange way to offer comfort to the girl, and it seemed stranger still when she began to console me, as though the loss were mine, not hers. For she said in a soft voice, "You must think of what you still have, Dick. Katrina is waiting for you at home." "Good God, Blanche," I cried, "it's you I'm thinking of." But I couldn't say any more. The position seemed too absurd. "You needn't think of me, Dick," she answered me. "I'm wonderfully happy. Really, I am. But, of course, you can't know all about that." "You don't look happy," I said. But turning to her, I saw all the weariness had gone from her face, and she was smiling with a wonderful contentment. "At least you didn't when I first saw you," I added. At that the shadow came back to her, and she said, "But it wasn't for myself I was worrying, Dick. I could be quite happy if it weren't for something that still baffles me." "Avery?" I asked. "Yes, that," she answered, "and something else, too. But I needn't bother you with it." "If it's anything to do with Avery," I said, "you'd better tell me all about it. I want to know just how things stand. Is he alive or dead?" "Why, dead, Dick," she answered. "Then what's all the fuss about?" I asked, puzzled. A tone of weariness came into her voice as she answered, "When I say dead, I'm using your language. He's dead enough to leave Katrina free. That's clear, isn't it?" "If he's dead enough," I began, but broke off with an exclamation of disgust. It all seemed so ridiculous. "He's either dead or not dead," I went on. "I don't see that there's any other alternative." "All right, then," she said, "we'll say he's dead, and you needn't bother about him any more." She added, "He's really buried, too, if that helps." I seemed to be plunged into deeper mysteries than ever. All this talk about being dead enough. I felt a little angry. Blanche was keeping something back from me, and I knew why, though she hadn't told me. It had to do with her spirit raisings, and I didn't want to hear anything about it, especially as she didn't seem at all clear in her own mind what the matter was. And then the thought came to me that she had probably been speaking to Olave himself. That was her consolation. A pretty thin one, I thought, but I was devoutly glad to feel she had any sort of consolation at all. Otherwise her loss would have been shattering. I even felt an illogical gratitude to the fantastic humbug which had brought comfort into her desolated life. "Have you told Katrina anything of all this?" I asked at last. "Nothing," she said. I hesitated for a moment, then asked, "And you honestly think I can go to her?" But I broke off in sudden shame and muttered, "I'm sorry, Blanche, I'm a selfish brute." At that she put her arms about me as she had done in the old days, and murmured, "No, dear, no, there's nothing I want so much as to see you two happy. Honestly, Dick, and I shall be angry with you if you haven't made all arrangements before the day's out." She pressed her face to mine, then drew back from me and smiled radiantly full into my face. "I don't understand," I muttered. "All I know is I'm so intent on my own happiness that I can't properly realize what you've got to bear." "If you'd only believe me," she said, still smiling. "I tell you I'm quite happy, Dick. You don't know, and it's Katrina you've got to think about, not me. She's suffered far more than I have, and now you can make it up to her." "You're a real brick, Blanche," I said humbly, "but I don't know that I feel like speaking to Katrina while—" "I turn my back on you," she exclaimed, doing so, and I even laughed. "Well, well," I said, "if I must, I must." "The noble, self-sacrificing youth!" she cried gaily. "But honestly," I said, growing serious again, "is it all straight? Is it above board?" "I wouldn't send you to her if it weren't," she replied, and with that I had to be satisfied. Our talk returned to Ursuline, and Blanche rattled into a gay recital of all his marvellous sayings and clever tricks, till at length the motor swung us round into the drive and up to the hall. I found Katrina waiting for me in the music-room. She was standing by the window as I entered. I paused at the door and gazed in a rapture of expectation at the little figure framed against the light. The longed-for moment had come. "You sent for me," I said, lingering out the sweetness. "Yes, Dick," she answered simply. I went to her, and taking her hand, pressed it to my lips. There was a delicious silence while we looked deep into each other's eyes. But what I read in those pools of blue was something so inexpressibly wonderful that it seemed like a desecration for a fellow like me to lay unsanctified hands on such a loveliness. With a troubled sense of my own unworthiness, I stooped and kissed her gently on the lips, and the next moment we were breast to breast, and all was spoken. Chapter 6. Raising my face at length, I found myself gazing abstractedly through the window out across the space of lawn to where the wall of woodland, still black and leafless, closed in the view. The stirring of a shadow struck at my attention, and whipped my mind back to the day when I had rushed to the pane to see Avery's figure vanishing into the woods. I blinked away the mist that dimmed my sight, and strained my eyes to the spot where I thought I had seen the shadow. There was nothing, but the inopportune recollection had troubled my content. Katrina was watching me, and looking down into her eyes, I tried to smile the frown out of my face. She drew a little away from me and said, "I know what you're thinking." "How beautiful you are," I replied. "Do you have to look away from me to think that?" she asked roguishly. I knew how to answer talk of that sort. "But honestly," she said more seriously, "I had a reason for choosing this room. In fact, this very spot. It's symbolic, Dick." "Ah," I smiled back, "you've been living with Blanche." "Yes," she admitted, "and I've learnt a lot, Dick. Symbols can be very expressive, you know." "And what's the symbol here?" I asked. "I don't think I'll tell you," she answered. "You look as if you're going to laugh." "There," I said, straightening my face. "Now expound, my lady of mystery." She looked at me very solemnly for a while, and then said, "Well, Dick, standing here with me and looking out to the woods, doesn't it remind you of something?" "It does," I admitted, "something I'd like to forget." "You can do better than forget," she said, and after a pause she went on, "You see, I wanted to make a clean break from all that. And he was in here with me that day, you remember, and I was thinking how wonderful he was, the music, but I've told you of that. And then I heard you come, and immediately I knew he was nothing to me. I just left him and ran to you." "And that was the proudest moment of my life," I said. "Well," she went on, "I wanted to go back to that and begin all over again, because afterwards I forgot. We saw him disappear over there." She pointed out to the woodlands. "See, there he goes," she said, and with a silly sense of alarm I glanced quickly at the spot where she was pointing, half expecting to see him merging into the shadows. "Well, we'll let him go," she continued, "and this time he won't come back." She turned to me impulsively and kissed me. The little play was ended, and I laughed delightedly. It was so charming and simple, and so altogether like Katrina, that I knew I should never forget the least detail of it. It was as though her love for me had been wrought into a clear, living picture, which I might always carry with me. Then Ursuline found us, and romped us away for a game. It was later in the day when Katrina took me to the chapel. We entered it from the vestry, and were immediately at the spot where Olave's grave should have been. The slab of stone on which I had nearly stepped on the day of the wedding still lay in the marble floor, but now it was inscribed with Olave's name, and behind it stood a large block of marble, very much like the one which rested on his father's grave. It hadn't been there when I was in the chapel last. It was evidently this which Katrina wanted me to see. She pointed to an inscription upon it. I leant forward to read it, for the place was only dimly lit by the falling glow of sunset. "Here lies," I made out, and started back. "I don't understand," I exclaimed. Then I turned to it once more and read the simple inscription through. "What does it mean?" I whispered. "This is his grave, you know," she answered me in the same hushed voice. "But," I said in perplexity, "wasn't he killed in France? How is it—" She understood the question without my finishing it. "Yes, yes," she answered, "but he will come." "Come?" I repeated. Then another question rose in my mind. "But when did you hear of his death?" I asked. "Blanche told me just a week ago," she answered. "Well, then, all this," I pointed to the marble block, "not much time wasted." "Oh," she explained, "Olave had that put there already." "Olave?" I exclaimed. "Dick," she said solemnly, "I believe he knew. But in any case he meant to leave things ready. Olave was like that, you know." "Yes," I agreed, "Olave was like that." "It's the same as father's," she began, but at that I fell back a step. I had the picture of myself treading on that slab of stone and sinking into the black earth, while the marble cenotaph came sliding over my head. "Let's go," I said. I felt I had laid in a store of unpleasant matter for a nightmare. And looking around the white and shadowy place, it seemed more haunted and sepulchral than it had done when I had first entered it that evening with Olave. Somehow the thought of a grave, ready hollowed and inscribed for a corpse that was yet to lie there, seemed more horrible than the knowledge that beneath the monuments that stood about the walls there actually lay the bodies of the dead. I drew a deep breath of the clean air as soon as I stepped into the open. Then I heard the sound of someone coming. Katrina drew me into the shadow of a tree, and Blanche and Mrs. Waite passed us by and went into the chapel. "What? That woman?" I muttered. "Doesn't she look tired?" said Katrina. "I didn't properly see," I answered, "but I wish she wasn't here." "She looks faded to a shadow," Katrina said, not heeding my exclamation. "Blanche doesn't have pity." We were indoors again before it occurred to me to ask where Olave was buried, and whether Blanche had applied for the removal of his body. "But she doesn't know," Katrina answered me. "How do you mean?" I asked. "You see, he was missing," she replied. "Quite," I said, "but now that she's had news of his death, they must be able to tell her—" "Dick," she broke in, "hasn't Blanche told you?" "Told me?" I asked. "What?" "Why, all about it," she said. "She's told me that she's heard," I answered. Katrina watched me for a moment in silence, then turned her eyes away. "Well, you see, Dick," she began, but broke off. There was evidently something troubling her which she found rather difficult to say. I waited, letting her take her own time. "Dick," she said at length, facing me again, "you must understand that Blanche has her own ways of learning things." "Good God!" I exclaimed. "Do you mean—" But I couldn't frame my thoughts in words. "All that Mrs. Waite business," I threw out as the best I could do to express myself. "Blanche has spoken to him," Katrina said. "To Olave," she added, to make sure I had understood. I looked sharply at the girl. She had spoken with such a simple acceptance of the thing that I thought she had been caught in the same net. "Surely not you, too," I said. "Yes, Dick," she replied, misunderstanding me. "I've spoken to him, too." "But surely," I broke out, "you don't believe in all that bunkum, do you?" She looked at me in dismay. "Dick, you're not angry with me, are you?" she asked, laying her hand on my arm. "Of course not," I said, rather ungraciously, patting her hand. "But these things are dangerous, you know." "Because it's not bunkum," she continued her own thought. "I don't pretend to understand it all, but it's not bunkum, Dick. Really, we spoke to each other. It was Olave, I'm sure of it. Though it was rather faint and uncertain, the way he spoke, I mean. You see, he hadn't been well." "Not well!" I cried. "I thought he was dead." "Yes, of course," she said, and went on quickly. "Oh, I can't explain properly. You must ask Blanche. I'm just making it all sound silly. But you see, he had rather a nasty passing. Blanche says It takes some time to recover from that sort of thing. They have doctors on the other side. They see to you. Oh, I don't know," she broke off with a little laugh. "No wonder you say it's bunkum. It sounds it when I talk about it like that. You must get Blanche to explain. But after all, we're in this world a good time before we quite know where we are." "Yes," I said, "but we never remember where we came from, if we came from anywhere." She looked away from me, biting her lip. I felt we were treading on the fringe of a quarrel, so I turned back to the original theme and said, "But has Blanche had no other notice of Olave's death than what she has learnt through Mrs. Waite?" "That's all, Dick," Katrina answered. "Then for all we know, he may still be alive," I said. She shook her head, while I muttered to myself, "Really, it's preposterous." It seemed clear to me that Mrs. Waite was imposing on Blanche. She had decided that it would be safe enough now to assume that Olave was dead, and on such evidence Blanche had had the tomb inscribed. She had even written, "Here lies." That sent my mind whirling to another problem. "But she doesn't know where he's buried, then?" I exclaimed. "No," said Katrina. I opened my hands and let them fall to my knees. "But she will know," Katrina added. "She must know." I thought I knew of what she was thinking. My mind went back to Olave saying that it was a matter of honor for our Guthrie to be buried with his ancestors. But he was missing, had been missing for more than a year. The prisoners were being returned. We should have heard by now if he had been captured merely. And if he had been killed, his body would have been identified before this, if it would ever be identified at all. Yet Blanche had written, "Here lies." "We won't talk about it any more," I said, more cheerfully, trying to ease the unpleasant atmosphere with a yawn and a smile. Blanche joined us at dinner, but Mrs. Waite didn't put in an appearance. I presumed she was staying in the house, as she had done when we were hunting for Katrina. Looking at Blanche's pale, drawn face, I guessed that Mrs. Waite had retired to her room, readier for bed than for company. And somehow I remembered Katrina's little expression, "Blanche doesn't have pity." I glanced at her again. There was something about the set and expression of her face which made me think of a queen of old time imposing her sovereign will on a multitude of slaves. There was something, too, of Beatrice Cenci, as she had performed the part years ago. I don't know why the memory of that came back to me just then, but we were a silent party, and my mind seemed busy with a host of half-remembered things. It was after dinner that I took Katrina by the hand, and leading her up to Blanche, said, "I've obeyed your orders." "I could see that," she replied, smiling back at us. "You'll be very happy." When we were retiring for the night, and Katrina had already left us, I took the chance to say a word to Blanche. "You're looking frightfully tired," I said, by way of a beginning. "You must take care of yourself." "I will, Dick, I promise you," she said. "When I put everything straight." "Things will straighten themselves," I told her, not quite knowing what to say. "No, Dick," she answered me firmly, "not tangles like these." "You may well talk of tangles," I exclaimed, seeing my opening. "Really, I don't understand you, Blanche." I went on into a confused harangue about the inscription on Olave's tomb, trying all the while to steer clear of anything that might sound unkind or tend to emphasize her bereavement, but probably in my clumsiness prodding her wound with every word. She heard me patiently to an end, and merely answered, "I shall find him, Dick. I must find him." Katrina's words. I knew where she had learnt them. "And I want you to help me," Blanche went on. "I wish I could," I said, "but honestly I don't think there's much chance." "But you see, Dick," she explained, "there's something that you know, something that will give me the clue I want." "Something that I know?" I questioned blankly. She came close to me and said slowly, "Olave's been trying to tell me, but I can't make it out. It's a sign." "Good God!" I muttered. She put her hands on my shoulders and said coaxingly, "Come, Dick, tell me. What is it?" "But Blanche," I began, "I don't understand. How could you know of it?" "Never mind," she said. "Just tell me what it is." "I'm sorry," I answered, "but honestly I've forgotten." "You must remember," she said, looking straight into my eyes. "I wish I could," I exclaimed in annoyance, "but I've been trying to remember ever since, for over a year. I can't get on the track of it. It's bothered me a lot." "You must remember," she repeated, still fixing me with her eyes. For a moment I thought it had come to me, but just then there was a burst of hammering at the front door and a terrible ringing of the bell. Chapter 7. We both stiffened, listening alertly. The clamor continued till the door was opened. There was a confused noise in the hall, and Dr. Dale broke in upon us. He looked round quickly, and seeing me, said, "Ah, you here, good. I didn't know." He spoke disjointedly, puffing somewhat. "Sorry to frighten you," he added, trying to smile. He collapsed onto a chair and threw open his overcoat, which in his hurry he hadn't taken off. He had his hat, too, in his hand, and seemed to become awkwardly aware of it, looking about him for somewhere to put it. I took it from him and laid it on a chair. "Thanks," he mumbled. "Thanks. Bit of a hurry. No need, I dare say. Didn't know you were here." He shook out a huge handkerchief and mopped his brow. Then, recovering himself somewhat, he beamed wanly at us and said, "I suppose you think I'm mad, but it seemed urgent. I had to come and warn you." All this while Blanche had said nothing. She had remained standing, watching the painful struggles of the doctor to calm himself. Now she came forward and said, "Well, doctor, just make yourself comfortable, and then let's hear what the matter is." The doctor rose, and I helped him to remove his coat. "Ah, that's better," he said, bracing himself and smoothing down his hair. He made as though to sit down, but first said, "Everything's all right here, I take it?" "Quite," Blanche assured him. "Good," he said, sitting down. "But I thought I'd better come and make sure." I was getting impatient. "Well, doctor," I addressed him, "what's it all about, anyway?" "Escaped lunatic," he answered me. "Another?" I couldn't help exclaiming. I glanced at Blanche and felt a sudden chill of alarm. She was standing motionless, her eyes fixed wide on Dr. Dale, and all the color gone from her face. The doctor was watching her, too, and I noticed he shuffled uneasily under her stare. He blinked and bit at his lip. Then, trying to smile, he said, "Oh, nothing to be alarmed at. Really nothing—" Blanche cut in coldly. "So I gathered from your manner of entry." He opened his hands and wrinkled up his brow, then turned to me and said, with a stupid snigger, "But you see, we have a Mr. Bellew with us. He knows how to settle escaped lunatics, eh?" He rubbed his hands nervously, but at Blanche's sharp, pained cry of "Doctor!" I saw him start and wince as though from the cut of a whip. And I, too, felt as though a sudden hand had gripped me, and a shudder went through me as she cried terribly, "He won't have the settling of this one." Her hands were pressed to her temples, and for a moment she swayed to and fro, her head thrown back and her teeth set. I thought she would have fallen, but I couldn't stir from where I stood. And then she seemed to recover her composure. Her hands fell to her sides, and she bowed her head. "No," she repeated quietly, "not this one, doctor." She raised her face and looked him steadily in the eyes. He seemed utterly at a loss, and began mopping at his brow again, muttering, "Well, really, really." There was an uneasy pause. I gazed from one to the other. I think they had forgotten me, for they both seemed taken aback when I said, "For God's sake, let's know what all the fuss is about." "Ah, yes, quite," said Dr. Dale. "An escaped lunatic—" "I know that," I cut in, "but what I don't see is how it affects us. Do all escaped lunatics inevitably gravitate our way?" "You see, Mr. Bellew," he explained, "we followed him as well as we could, and traced him as far as the wood here. He's probably hiding in the neighborhood, so I thought I had better warn you." "And is that all?" I asked. "That's all," he said. "Well," I began to wonder what the excitement was about. Then, glancing at Blanche, I cried, "That isn't all, doctor. You're keeping something back." He looked helplessly to Blanche. I knew what his questioning gaze meant. He didn't know whether he would be doing right in telling me what underlay the business, for it was clear to me by now that there was a secret between these two which was dark to me. I strode up to him and said gruffly, "Look here, there's something in the air. I want to know what it is. If there's any danger threatening us, I'm the one to deal with it." I thought a little bullying might help to unseal his lips, but I had mistaken my man. He seemed to grow sulky, and said, "If you want to know more, you must ask Mrs. Guthrie." I walked away from him, and again there was an awkward pause while Blanche and the doctor seemed to be conversing with their eyes. I sat down to await what might come of it all. I had made up my mind not to leave them together, as I felt a sort of obstinate desire to get to the heart of the mystery. If they intended to talk, they would have to do so in front of me. And then, too, I didn't know what the danger was, nor what it involved. Katrina might be implicated, and if so, I was determined to take things into my own hands. I knew something of the strength and devilry of lunatics. I had nearly been killed by one, and the thought of one prowling in the neighborhood was unpleasant enough in itself. But added to that was the feeling that there was something particularly frightful about this one. The doctor's frantic bursting in upon us, and Blanche's terrible cry when he had suggested that I could shoot the creature, had shaken me uneasily. It was Blanche who broke the silence. She said, with quiet decision, "You'd better tell us all about it, Doctor, from the very beginning. Dick ought to know. And then I'm still very much in the dark myself. There are things I haven't managed to unravel yet. You can probably help me." She sat down as though prepared to listen to a long story. The doctor drew a deep breath, and crossing his legs and sticking his thumbs into his waistcoat, said, "Well, I've been wanting to tell you. It will relieve me to get it off my mind. We've had a pretty bad time, you know, and it's worried me." He paused, then began again with emphasis. "Avery Booth, you remember." "What?" I cried. "Avery?" Just then the door opened, and Katrina stood on the threshold. The doctor started up in confusion and bowed to her awkwardly. Blanche said, "Come in, Katrina." "What is it?" she asked, looking round in inquiry. "The doctor is going to tell us a story," said Blanche. "It will interest you." "No," I cried, breaking from the sudden horror that had numbed me. I rose quickly and went to Katrina. "Go back to bed," I said. "It will only trouble you." Katrina looked from me to Blanche. Then, turning back to me, she smiled and said, "But I'd rather stay, Dick. I heard you speak that name." I tried to urge her away, but she shook her head. So I drew up a chair for her, and leaning over the back, prepared for the story with a sickening sense of apprehension at my heart. The doctor looked round at us, and with a shrug began again. "I'm afraid I've been raising expectations," he said, "but I haven't much to tell. It's merely the story of a war lunatic. Shell-shock case, I suppose, and little wonder the fellow was nastily smashed. Both legs off, face too horrible to be seen, body all twisted, so forth. He wears a mask always. In fact, we keep him covered from head to— I was going to say to foot, but he ends halfway. He's really too appalling a sight to endure. You couldn't even get used to it. Of course, I've had to attend to him at times. I still dream. He's like that, you see, so we keep him covered. That is, if he lets us. He's frightfully strong. I suppose the strength of his legs has gone to his arms, something like a blind man becoming extraordinarily keen of hearing. And he seems to take rather an unholy delight in exposing himself. People simply scream when they see him. I can believe the old yarn of the Gorgon now. Only yesterday he set on one of the attendants. His mask fell off, and the man saw his face. He just went sick. "For God's sake, stop," I broke in. "Sorry," he said, "but I had to give you the picture. You see, that's the one that's escaped. He's about here somewhere." "Very well," I said. "If I meet him, I'll know what to do." "I hope to God you'll meet him, then," the doctor cried impulsively. "I shan't sleep easily while he's still above the earth." I was taken aback, not expecting such an outbreak. "He's thoroughly evil," he explained. "He's not a mere lunatic. He seems to know what he's doing and takes a devilish delight in it. In fact," the doctor turned to me, "I seem to know what people mean now when they say ugly as sin." That jerked my mind back to his mention of Avery. I felt my heart leap and set off with a heavy thumping. "Go on," I said, my throat feeling strangely dry. "Let's hear the worst." But the doctor was again holding a mute discourse with Blanche. His brow was raised as though in inquiry. "Yes, go on," I thundered. "Well, then," he resumed, "here's the extraordinary thing." He sniggered, as though to set us at ease. I laid hold of Katrina's hand, feeling that at last the climax had come. "You see," he said, "a lunatic is merely a weak-minded person who has yielded to a fantasy. It's usually easy enough to understand why. A charwoman calls herself the Empress of China." "Oh, cut that out," I exclaimed impatiently. "Well," he turned to me, "this fellow chooses to call himself Avery Booth." Katrina pulled her hand free from mine and sprang to her feet. "It's my husband," she said. "He's still alive." Blanche came quickly across to her, and I tried to get possession of her hand. "No, Dick, no!" she cried. Blanche led her from me, and they sat down together. I collapsed onto the empty chair. "Go on," said Blanche to the doctor. Her voice sounded toneless and hollow, as though she were performing a task that had been imposed on her. I looked towards her. She had one arm about Katrina, and had the girl's hands clasped upon her lap. But her face was turned to the doctor. I couldn't read from it what was passing in her mind. Her brow was smooth and her lips steady, but her cheeks were very pale. "Go on," she said again. "Yes, but how?" he asked. "You see, it's all such a puzzle, because it isn't Avery at all. If it were Avery, then there'd be no reason to keep the fellow at St. Jude's. He was sent to us from hospital because he insisted on calling himself Avery Booth. But when inquiries were made, it was found that Avery Booth was dead and buried. All that was gone into pretty carefully. There couldn't be any mistake about it. So he was handed over to us. He must have met Avery somewhere and taken to him, and now he's got the idea that he's Avery himself. It's just understandable, I suppose. A weak-minded fellow might conceive rather an admiration for a man of Avery's power. So there it is." I began to breathe more freely. "But isn't there anything to identify him by?" I asked. "Well, yes, but it leads nowhere," he said uneasily. "There are bits of evidence, but they don't tally." "What evidence?" I asked. He began to shift in his seat, and obviously to evade me, answered, "Well, for one thing, he seems to know all sorts of things about Avery, which it's unlikely that anyone except Avery himself could know. Things which have been examined and proved, I mean. In fact, there are some things that I know for certain were secrets between Avery and me. And if he isn't Avery, how's he got to know them? But he isn't Avery, because Avery's dead. That's the puzzle." I thought over that for a minute, then asked, "But are there no physical signs to identify him by?" "I tell you he's smashed," he answered. "But his eyes?" I suggested. "Ah," he exclaimed, "there again. I should know Avery's eyes in a million." "Well?" I waited. "Well," he answered, "they are Avery's eyes, all right." "Good God," I said. "Black," he went on. "But it isn't only their color. It's everything about them. If you've ever seen his eyes, you'd know." "Yes, I know," I said. Then Blanche asked very clearly, "But were they always black?" The doctor didn't answer her for a minute. Then he exclaimed, "Yes, since he'd been with me, but before?" she asked again. "I don't know," he said, slowly, as though his mind were busy with a thought. He was gazing very fixedly at Blanche, and I heard him mutter several times, "My God!" Again there was silence for a while. Though my thoughts were in a confused tangle, I seemed to see by glimpses something of the reason of Blanche's strangeness when she had spoken to me of Avery. She had told me that Katrina was free, but it hinted that there was still something unsettled and mysterious about Avery's death. She had probably heard about this lunatic. But I couldn't get anything clear in my mind. The glimpses of understanding faded before I could focus them. There was a sort of floating infusion of disunited ideas in my head, but I couldn't find the necessary viewpoint which would show them in their right relation. All I knew for certain was that Avery's shadow had fallen again between Katrina and myself, and I wondered whether it would ever lift, for now it wasn't merely as if the man himself were keeping us apart. There was something subtle, something preternatural and incomprehensible, which baffled me and left me struggling ineffectually, as though with an image of vapor. I became aware of Blanche speaking. I must have missed part of what she said, because I had become wrapped in my own thoughts. What I heard was, "There is a sign." I didn't know what she was referring to, but my mind went back with a jerk to Olave and the mark he had had tattooed upon him, and suddenly I remembered what it was. Without thinking how utterly irrelevant my exclamation must seem, I cried, "Yes! The sword and the serpent!" The doctor sprang up as though I had struck him, and still gripping his chair in one hand, he gazed at me with wide eyes. Then, swaying slowly, he fell back into his chair, exclaiming faintly, "My God! My God!" "Why, what on earth?" I looked at him in wonder, utterly unable to understand his emotion. Blanche went up to him and said, "That's quite enough, Dr. Dale. I'm very much obliged to you. Of course you'll stay tonight." She rang the bell, and before I could recover enough to ask what it all meant, the doctor had said good night, and was being shown to his room. "What is it, Blanche?" I asked, as the door closed behind him. She looked at me with that deep gaze of hers, and said quietly, "The story will soon be ended, Dick." I looked doubtfully across at Katrina, who was standing away from me, with her hands clasped at her breast. Blanche went to her and led her up to me. She took our hands and joined them, but Katrina drew hers away and said, "No, not yet, Dick. I don't know." Blanche looked at us, then, dropping her arms to her sides, she bowed her head and went from the room. I was left alone with Katrina. For a moment I felt a surging desire to claim her for my own, to plead with her to put aside all thought and memory of Avery, to tell her he was safely buried where he couldn't rise to divide us. But the words sank dead at my lips. I took her hand and kissed it, and, saying good night, stepped aside for her to pass. Before going to my room, I took a turn outside. The night was very dark, but in the east there was the glow of the rising moon. The air was still, and everything spoke of a wonderful peace. Drawing a deep breath, I went inside again, feeling soothed and relieved. The calm and quiet of the night were like a promise or a blessing. I went upstairs to my room, but a sudden thought sent me to Blanche. I knocked at her door. She opened to me. "Have you a revolver?" I asked. "You won't need it, Dick," she answered. "It was useful last time," I pressed her. "But this is different," she said. I went back to my room with the spell of the quiet night broken in my heart, and the old uneasiness fretting me more distressingly than ever. Chapter 8. Shut in by myself, a stupid nervousness began to take possession of me. I paced my room, knowing quite well that I was too shaken and restless to think of sleeping yet a while. So much seemed to have happened that day to disturb me: the excitement of the return to England, the emotional stress of the meeting with Katrina, and more unsettling still, the strange circumstances that had enveloped in mystery the revelation of Olave's death, culminating in the sudden bursting in upon us of the terrified doctor with his talk of Avery and the escaped lunatic. Never had I felt myself so utterly adrift amid shifting uncertainties. I found myself harking back in an inconsequential way first to one, then to another of the exciting incidents of the day, till at last everything became confused into one blurred picture. At one moment I was repeating something particularly delicious that Katrina had said to me, and the next I was living again that horrible moment when the doctor had let loose upon us the name of Avery. And always I felt a fear hovering at the back of my mind, and trying to analyze it, I suddenly realized it was due to my being unarmed. If anything happened, I should be powerless to meet it. Why anything should happen, I didn't ask myself, though I did feel about among my fears for what might happen. But I couldn't come upon it. It wasn't the escaped lunatic, for when the memory of the creature lurking in the neighborhood came consciously into my thoughts, I laughed it away. I didn't suppose for a moment that there was really anything to fear from the fellow, whoever he was and however powerful he might be. and yet it troubled me to be without a weapon. But when I tried to get on the track of the thing that was disturbing me, I couldn't run it to earth. I suppose it was just the sum total of all the strange occurrences of the day that had combined to throw me into a fine state of nervous upset. Feeling angry with myself, I pulled off my clothes, switched out the light, and threw myself on the bed. But though I turned from side to side, and one by one threw off the blankets, which seemed to be stifling me, I couldn't get a wink of sleep. My head was in a whirl, and that made me angrier still, because of the unusualness of the thing. As a rule, disturbing thoughts fell from me like ripe fruit as soon as my head touched the pillow. Even in the days when Katrina had been missing, I had slept soundly enough. Again and again I asked myself what was troubling me. I went through the experiences of the day item by item, and told myself that there was nothing to keep me awake. True, there might be work for me on the morrow, unpleasant work, perhaps, for there would almost certainly be that lunatic to hunt down, for one thing. But that was only an added reason for me to get a good night's rest. Then the question seemed to come from nowhere, who was the lunatic? By the sickness at my heart, I thought I had come face to face with the real cause of my fear. Who was the lunatic indeed? Was it Avery? But as soon as I put the question like that, I felt reassured. Not only had I satisfied myself that Avery was dead and buried, but Blanche had definitely told me it was so, and the doctor, too, hinted that an official inquiry had been made into the matter as well. There could be no doubt on that point. Well, who was he, then? I told myself it didn't matter in the least. As long as he wasn't Avery, he might call himself what he chose. So I turned over again and determined I would keep awake no longer. I had heard that one way of sending oneself to sleep was to take deep breaths until the temples began to throb. I tried it, and felt the blood begin to thump at my ears. A sort of warm singing silence seemed to grow out of the heavy pulsing and cover me like a soft robe. Then suddenly I was frightfully awakened by a violent knocking and ringing. I sat up in bed, with the echoes buzzing in my ears. I listened, but the house was deathly still. Not a murmur of the shattering clamor lingered in the air. "Good God," I muttered, "I've been dreaming." I lay down again and dug my head viciously into the pillow. At any rate, I had been to sleep. The thought was consoling. If I had succeeded once, I might succeed again. I began to breathe with great lungfuls, and then I was falling into a deep black hole in the earth. Something came down over my head. I started up, beating wildly at the clothes which had got tangled round my face. I turned over and felt myself suddenly seized from behind by two powerful arms and whirled violently off my feet. And as I jerked back to consciousness, I seemed to see a masked, cloaked figure creeping stealthily away. I got out of bed and switched on the light. I felt I couldn't stand any more of this sort of thing. I felt I would go mad if I continued to have such dreams. The night was chilly, so I pulled on some clothes, and taking down a book, set myself to read. But of course my mind wandered from the page. I tried to fix my attention on the story, but a few consecutive words were all that I could take in. The sentence faded before my eyes, half read. I tossed the thing away and commenced pacing the room. Looking at my watch, I found it was still not 1 o'clock. I shook the thing and listened to hear if it were going. I could have sworn I had been prisoned in that place for hours, yet I suppose I hadn't been undressed for more than half an hour at the most. I felt frightened. If the whole night were to drag itself away at such a leaden pace, I thought I should be raving long before the morning. It was little enough comfort to have the room lit. I had the sense of things behind me, pacing with me as I strode from door to window. I kept turning quickly to try to catch them at their game, but they were too quick for me, and whisked round me as I turned. I dropped into a chair and called myself a thundering fool for yielding to such crazy fantasies. Just the way to make things worse, I argued against it in my mind, and the next moment leapt from my chair and grabbed fiercely behind it for something that I felt was lurking there. Of course my hand clasped air. I pulled the chair away. Just nothing. But I didn't dare sit down again. and during my pacing I kept a watchful eye on the suspected chair. Then I began to suspect other things. I stooped to peer under the bed, but swung round suddenly to see what it was breathing on my neck. Then I opened the wardrobe door, and for a moment had a terrible scare, for the hanging clothes gave me the impression of someone drawn up alert and waiting. That made me ask myself what I would do if I should actually see a face looking at me as I peered under the bed or behind some piece of furniture. The cold shudder that the thought gave me prevented me for a while from indulging in the fantastic game. But then the window curtains began to fascinate me. I turned from them, only to wonder what was on the other side of my bedroom door. And so, at either end of my path, I was tortured with a teasing desire to fling open the door or tear aside the curtains. On the whole, the curtains tempted me most. They swayed and swelled and subsided so noiselessly and stealthily that it seemed as though there were a moving thing behind them, hesitating to throw them aside and leap out. I went up to them and twitched them suddenly apart. I found myself looking out into the moonlight. For in spite of the brightness of my room, the air was silvery with moonlight, though I couldn't see the moon. For my window faced west, and the shadow of the house lay black beneath me, though the lawn lay white beyond. I gazed out into the night, straining for a movement, but everything was still. My fancy distorted the bushes and the trees into images of fear, but all the while I knew them for what they were, checking them in my memory. Then, on the landing outside my door, I heard the least creak. It was all that I wanted to steady me. I turned about, feeling suddenly calm. I knew that something was going to happen, and I welcomed it as a relief to my tortured nerves. I went to the door and opened it. The light of my room lit up the balcony and the empty space beneath the dome, and shone across to the door of Katrina's room, which lay opposite. I looked out, but there was nothing to be seen. I left my room, pulling the door to behind me, and the darkness closed me in. Very quietly I made for Katrina's room, feeling my way round by the balustrade, and outside her door I came to a halt, listening. But all was silent, and though I waited there longer than I could reckon, I couldn't hear a sound. Disappointed, I made my way back to my room. Before I reached it, I was shaking with terror of the dark. All my calmness had deserted me. I had been braced for action, and finding nothing to be done, my fear had returned upon me. My fingers stumbled upon the switch of the dome light, and suddenly I was out of the dark. For a moment I was startled, but it was good to be in the wholesome light once more, and with a gasp of relief I moved on again to my room. And so the long misery began all over again. But now it wasn't merely my own room that I paced so restlessly. I made excursions round the balcony, listening intently behind each door. Sometimes I thought I could hear the sound of breathing, and sometimes there was nothing but the shrill singing of the silence in my ears. And back to my room I came, only to start out once more. And always I was tempted to go farther afield, where the long black corridor led to remoter parts of the house. Returning to my room for the third time, I looked at my watch. 1:30. At that a sweat broke out all over me. I felt the night would never end. It was almost more than I could do to restrain myself from waking up Blanche to share my vigil with me. And still I was fascinated by what I felt was happening across the landing. I couldn't keep away from Katrina's door. There was a deepening conviction in my mind that something was taking place there, something evil and terrible. I didn't attempt to shape it in my thoughts, though flying images chased through my head from the hideous dreams that had already alarmed me, and standing there, listening for some sound that might tell me what was happening, or some least little cry for help that would justify my breaking in, I couldn't help thinking of the days when I had slept on guard there. But even that wasn't so bad as this, and yet, with my ear pressed to the panel, I couldn't hear a sound. But whenever I turned away, I seemed to catch dull mufflings of movement that drew me back to my post again, feverishly uncertain. By this time I had given up any attempt to control myself. It was useless telling myself I was merely playing the fool, yielding weakly to empty shadows and imaginings. I was prepared to laugh at myself on the morrow, but meanwhile the sense of dark happenings had become too real to shake off, and I thought I had located the center of terror. It was behind that door, where Katrina lay. More than once I had my fingers on the handle, closing about it, ready to fling the door wide, but something restrained me. I think it was the fear of being premature, of scaring the evil thing, whatever it might be, before I could catch it at its work, rather than any scruple of startling Katrina, which held me back, listening, straining my ears to interpret each least stirring of sound. And at last it came clearly and unmistakably. My senses were alert and my fear gone. I flung the door open and broke into the room. There was a splitting scream. I rushed across to the window where Katrina was framed darkly against the full glare of the moon. She was leaning half out, and in another moment would have fallen. I caught her in my arms, and she collapsed in a swoon upon my breast. I had hardly laid her on the bed before the room was flooded with light, and Blanche stood at the door, and in another moment Dr. Dale had joined us too. Katrina lay moaning brokenly while I knelt beside her, and then, recovering consciousness, she opened wide eyes full upon me. It was clear that she was at a loss to know where she was, or what had happened. She lay for a while gazing at me blankly. Then, seeming to remember something of what had occurred, she tried to raise herself up and speak, but fell back to the pillow, muttering incomprehensibly. Blanche was standing over her. She laid her hand on the girl's brow, and Katrina looked away from me to her. "What is it?" Blanche asked in a steady voice. But Katrina was still unable to speak. She shook her head feebly and closed her eyes. "Katrina?" Blanche spoke sharply, and Katrina opened her eyes with a frightened start and looked up at her with what seemed to me a growing comprehension. "What is it?" Blanche repeated. There was another space of silence while the two gazed at each other. Then all of a sudden Katrina sat upright, clasping her hands together and staring wildly before her. "Avery!" she cried. Then she shook her head violently and exclaimed, "Don't ask me! Oh, don't ask me!" "You must tell me," said Blanche. Katrina covered her eyes with her hands and muttered, "But I want to forget. I want to forget." "What about Avery?" Blanche persisted, with what seemed to me needless cruelty. I would have interrupted but for the knowledge that Blanche intended to have her way. It was evident in her expression. Katrina threw an appealing gaze at her, and clasping her hands convulsively, cried, "But it was horrible, horrible! At the window. I saw him. Slowly. He came in and stood by me. Ugh!" Her voice broke on a sob of disgust, and I threw my arms about her. Her broken phrases had given me a picture of the whole thing. My memory went back to a similar experience of my own. I could see the black form creeping up into the moonlight, and Katrina, spellbound with horror, watching it slowly frame itself against the window. I felt her body cold against my arm, and she was trembling violently. Then a spasm seemed to shake her whole frame, and she whispered, "I saw him." No one spoke. She gazed round at us vacantly, and suddenly cried, "I tell you, I saw him!" She gave a frenzied laugh and dug her hands into her eyes. The doctor was muttering, "Oh, my God!" I knew what Katrina meant, though I couldn't realize the full horror of it. The creature had taken off its mask. Then Blanche said, "There, that's enough." She gently urged the girl to lie down again, and motioned me away. I went from the room with the doctor, for Blanche dismissed him too. Outside, I turned to him and asked hoarsely, "What does it mean?" He was dabbling at his perspiring face. "Hell knows," he exclaimed. "But is it Avery?" I pressed him. "Don't ask me." He pushed me aside. "Don't ask me anything. I don't want to hear anything about it. I've had enough of it, I tell you. It's getting on my nerves. It's driving me mad. I'll never have a decent night's sleep again." He was hurrying off, but I held him back. "Look here," I said sharply, "this is your business, I reckon. Here's one of your lunatics broken loose again. It's your job to explain what it means. Why has he chosen this house to break into, and Katrina's room? He cut me short with an angry, "I don't want to hear anything about it." He clapped his hands to his ears. I pulled them away and exclaimed, "But you're going to answer me before I let you go. Is this Avery? That's what I want to know." He turned upon me and cried viciously, "Haven't you said yourself that he chose this house and his wife's room?" "Stop!" I shouted. I felt I could have knocked him to the floor. Instead, I flung away from him and strode back to my room. My intention was to get on some thicker clothes and go and hunt for that abominable thing. I could think of it as a man. The doctor's description of the legless trunk with the powerful arms and the distorted face had somehow made me think of old Jock's mangled body. I had the impression of something loathsome and inhuman, bestial and soulless. But it wasn't merely the horror of such a creature having appeared to Katrina and unmasked itself before her that made my heart sick. It was the significance of his having selected Katrina as his victim. The doctor had given me the answer I had dreaded to hear. His wife's room. The words echoed in my ears like a mocking refrain. In spite of all that Blanche had told me of Avery's being dead and buried, in spite of her reassurances and my own investigations in the matter, I knew now that Avery was alive, and that this was none other than Avery himself. I felt an urgency to track him down and to settle him once for all. There would be no mistake this time. Then I suddenly remembered I was still unarmed. But Blanche must have a revolver of Olave's somewhere in the house. I had forgotten for the moment that she had already refused to let me have one. I pulled on my coat and made for Katrina's room. As I opened the door, I seemed to see again the girl leaning from the window, as I had found her when I had first broken in. The fancy passed in a flash, but I seemed to see now something I hadn't seen then. There were two arms locked about her, forcing her through. Avery had come to carry her away. If I had waited another moment, she would have been lost to me. Blanche turned as I entered. She motioned me to be quiet. I looked to Katrina. She was asleep, but her lips were moving uneasily, and her face was bitterly unhappy. I tiptoed to the bed. "I want a revolver," I said. Blanche shook her head. "But it's Avery come back," I insisted. She looked me in the eyes, and again shook her head. "I tell you," I began again, "he mesmerized her, and was carrying her away with him. She was half out the window." "Yes, I know," she said. "Well, then—" But my expostulations were cut short. A wail seemed to rise from the heart of the house, and came ringing down the corridor. Blanche pulled me quickly out of the room, and closed the door behind her. I suppose she was afraid of Katrina being awakened. The noise was on us now. It was Ursulline's nursemaid who came running up to us in wild disarray, crying unintelligibly. Blanche caught her by the arm and steadied her. "Well?" she asked. The girl was blubbering hysterically. "Gone!" she cried. "He's gone! Ursulline!" She collapsed to her knees, clinging to Blanche and sobbing in choking gulps. I looked at Blanche in stupid dismay. She was drawn up straight and rigid, and in her eyes blazed a fire that terrified me. She stood speechless, her breast heaving, but her face white and set like a statue's. I didn't dare speak her name. She walked away from me and left me standing there gazing after her. The girl clutched at my arm and would have raced out into a tearful story of what had happened, but I knew what had happened without being told. I shook myself free of her, and she fell away from me with a moan. I turned and raced down the stairs and out of the house. I knew that if I found Avery, I should kill him without scruple. Even in my rage against him, I was sane enough to realize that now he was my lawful prey. A lunatic, an outcast, a public danger. The expressions ran through my head like shouts of laughter. He was delivered up to me. He was mine to catch and kill. But morning found me still vainly hunting for him. He had melted into the night, and not a trace of him could I discover. End of section 10. Read by Thomas Copeland. Section 11 of The Shadowy Thing by H.B. Drake. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Part 3, Chapter 9. During the days that followed, Blanche was almost unapproachable, and I was left to take what action I thought best in the matter of recovering Ursuline. At first, of course, I told Blanche what I was doing, and asked her what else there was to be done. I thought she would send me scouring the country, as she had done when Katrina had been kidnapped. But she didn't seem to take any interest in my movements. When I told her I had set the police on Avery's track, she broke into a scornful laugh. When I asked her where I should search for him, she said, "Don't." I couldn't understand her behavior, unless it was that she was driven half-mad by anxiety. Her face was like an unchanging mask, for I could read nothing from it except a burning determination to win back her child. That was clear enough, but whether she were hopeful or otherwise, I couldn't read a sign to tell me. There was never a trace of any passing or surface emotion, but always there was the white-set grimness that I had seen come over her when the nursemaid had run screaming to her with the news of Ursuline's disappearance. It was as though her spirit were ever at white heat, and her eyes were filled with the fire of it. I was glad to avoid her, for I felt utterly useless, and it seemed to me that my presence merely irritated her to an intenser pitch of anger or indignation, or whatever it was which set her lips into such a hard, thin line. Looking at her sometimes, I thought her face was the cruelest thing I had seen. The girl looked capable of cold and calculated murder, and I wondered what she was planning for Avery when she should win him into her power. That she was busy day and night weaving some subtle scheme, I could guess well enough. At times I caught a glimpse of Mrs. Waite creeping wearily up to her room. I knew she had come from some exhausting sitting with Blanche. Once I saw the pair coming from the chapel. Evidently the sittings took place there. But what Blanche hoped to gain from them, I didn't ask myself. If I thought anything, it was that she was trying to learn where Avery was hidden. And perhaps she would soon have work for me. If she came upon his track, I guessed she would send me after him. I think it was this, even more than any desire to be near Katrina, that kept me lingering at Hinton Hall, when I should have felt mightily relieved to have been at Chalk Ridge, away from Blanche's uncomfortable presence. But I stayed on, day after day, expecting that at any time she might send me racing off on Avery's track. But the days wore on, and nothing seemed to happen. Katrina had recovered pretty well from the shock of that terrible apparition, but her treatment of me was rather puzzling. She kept away from me, and I gathered that now that Avery was alive again, for it seemed to me that he must have risen from the dead, Katrina felt it best for us to part. She was obviously uneasy in my company, and I didn't attempt to press myself upon her. But on the other hand, I didn't want to desert her if she really wished me to stay. Thinking I might have misinterpreted her avoidance of me, I asked her plainly one day whether she wanted me to go. She looked timidly up into my face, and the tears started to her eyes. She laid a hand on my arm and said, "That's rather unkind." Of course, I was all protestations that I merely wanted to know what she would have me do. She turned away from me and faltered, "I think, Dick, you ought to go." That was all I needed. I raised her hand and kissed it, and turned and left her. Then I sought out Blanche. If she had no use for me, it was clearly my best plan to quit. I came upon her at length, having waylaid her as she left the chapel. I opened the matter without preliminaries, saying, "I'm thinking of going home, Blanche. Do you want me here?" "No, Dick," she answered, without hesitation. "Right," I said, turning away, but I stopped to add, "Of course, if you need me, I'm at your disposal." "I won't need you," she said. Somehow I was piqued to know what her plan of campaign was. She was keeping it mighty secret, and I felt she ought to have taken me into her confidence. I think it was her abrupt acceptance of my offer to leave her which brought my curiosity to a head. "Look here," I said, "you don't tell me much, and you don't seem to be making much headway. Haven't you got a clue yet, or what?" "You needn't worry, Dick," she said. "That's almighty fine," I cried, beginning to bluster. It annoyed me to see her standing there so straight and frigid, with all her thoughts masked away from me behind that inscrutable white countenance. "I tell you it's all right," she said. "All right?" I cried in amazement. "Yes, Dick, quite all right," she repeated. "Well, then," I said feebly, "it doesn't seem so to me, that's all." She took a step nearer to me and said, "But you see, Dick, you don't understand." "No, I jolly well don't," I exclaimed. She looked me full in the eyes for a moment, then, turning away, said, "But it wouldn't help to tell you." "Look here," I broke out, catching her by the arm, "I don't suppose I should understand if you did tell me, but at least you might let me know where Avery's hidden. I expect you've found out that much, haven't you?" "Yes, I know that," she said. "Well, then," I exclaimed. It seemed preposterous. It was my turn to fling away from her, and her turn to hold me back. She said very slowly, "I could have Versullen back tomorrow if I wished." I waited for her to continue. "But you see, there's a condition," she went on. "Well?" I asked. "I must give Katrina in exchange." I fell back in dismay. Yet I must have been dull indeed not to have guessed as much before. "Does she know?" I faltered at length. "No," she said, "and she never must know." "Ah," I exclaimed, relieved. There was another pause. Then I said, "Well, it seems to me that you'd better put me on Avery's trail and let me settle the fellow." "That would be disastrous," she exclaimed with fervor. "Why, how?" I asked, taken aback. Again she drew near to me and said, "Why will you ask these questions, Dick? Why must you know things you can't understand?" I shuffled uneasily. I didn't like the look in her eyes. She went on, "Very well, then, let me tell you. Versullen will come back to me." She paused, and added in a voice that thrilled me, "Olave will bring him." "Olave!" I exclaimed. "Yes, Dick," she said. "But good God, Blanche," I cried, "what on earth do you mean? Olave? Are you going to raise him from the dead?" She stared in my eyes, with her face right close to mine, and said, "Have you ever heard of Lazarus?" With that she turned swiftly away and left me in my stupefaction. I looked after her with an unspeakable fear at my heart. It seemed clear to me that her troubles were turning her head. I determined to leave for home the next morning, and accordingly set out soon after breakfast. But it wasn't pleasing to find on my arrival at Chalk Ridge that the gypsies had once again settled themselves in Morton's dingle. There seemed to me a sinister connection between their presence there and Avery's reappearance. I jumped to the immediate conclusion that Avery was in hiding with them, and it wasn't long after my arrival before I was tramping down to the encampment with the intention of raising hell's delight. Yet I came away having achieved nothing. The cringing of the wretches and the squalid misery of their encampment disarmed my determination. Feeling all the time that they were imposing upon me, I couldn't bring myself to believe that such a despicable crew could possibly do any serious mischief. They seemed to have no spirit, no force. They whined and fawned and pleaded, till in disgust I turned away and left them masters of the place. I knew I had behaved weakly, and was angry with myself. I even said I would go the next day and turn them off without listening to what they might say. But I knew perfectly well that I had no intention of doing any such thing. So they stayed. And then the days began to drag themselves out more wearisomely than at Hinton Hall. For though I was free from Blanche, with her ghostly face and bright wild eyes, yet now I was at the mercy of my own disturbing thoughts, and with nothing but the boredom of my own company to take my mind off things. Again and again I puzzled over Blanche's cryptic reference to Olave and Lazarus, but always I told myself that the girl was driving herself crazy with her absurd fantasies. The more I thought of that scene, the more it seemed to me that it was the dawning light of madness I had seen in her face. The way she had stared at me, with her eyes blazing full into mine, came back to me again and again. If I shut my eyes, I would see her looking at me with her face not an inch away, and always I said to myself, "The girl's mad." And yet I couldn't have sincerely believed that it was madness which had made her behave in such a way, for if so, I wouldn't have waited idly at home, expecting every day to hear from her that her salon had been restored, or at least to receive a summons from her, or orders to be away in pursuit of Avery. I must have trusted her deep in my heart, for I didn't attempt to go behind her and make investigations on my own account, and sometimes I was puzzled at my own inactivity. It fretted me to be idle when there was such an evident need for action. Yet there I stayed at home, doing nothing, but chafing at heart at the weary and ineffectual delay. It was some days after my return home that I received an urgent call from the gypsy camp to visit them immediately. It was a scrubby little brat of a boy who brought the summons. He tried to explain that the gypsies were grateful to me for leaving them in peace, and in recompense for my kindness wanted to do me a service. Of course I sent the brat bundling, with an angry refusal to have anything to do with the cursed crew. Yet somehow, shortly after he had left me, protesting vociferously against my suspicion, my mind altered. After all, there was nothing else to do. If there were any trouble, it would be a relief. So I pocketed my revolver and set off. The boy had arrived before me with my message, which seemed to have caused consternation in the camp. At any rate, when I broke in on them unexpectedly, I found the whole clan gathered into a wildly chattering group. But at the sight of me they split apart, ejaculating incomprehensibly, and I was more suspicious than ever. I thrust my hand into my revolver pocket and stepped up to them. "What is it?" I asked severely. Nobody ventured to explain, but fingers were pointing to one of the tents, and it seemed to me that I was expected to enter. I made a step towards it, and heads nodded me to proceed. Clearly there was somebody hidden in that tent who was supposed to be of interest to me. Suddenly my mind came on the meaning of the thing. I didn't stop to ask whether the gypsies were acting in faith or not, but I guessed that it was Avery who lay concealed there. It might have been a trap, or perhaps, for some reason or other, the gypsies really wanted to betray him to me. I didn't stay to argue that out. With a quick step, I walked to the tent and threw aside the curtain, drawing my revolver as I did so. A black figure rose from the bedding on the ground. I raised my revolver swiftly, but fell back with a cry when I saw Katrina. Then, dropping the curtain behind me, I entered the tent. "Katrina!" I exclaimed. She didn't say a word, but stood facing me steadily. "What is it?" I asked at length. "Dick, why didn't you tell me?" she said. "Tell you?" I didn't understand. "You knew," she said. "You must have known." "But what?" I asked. "The price," she answered me. "The price?" I questioned. Then the meaning came to me. Blanche had told her of Avery's condition. "But that's impossible," I cried, trying to take her by the wrists. She drew back angrily and said, "No, Dick, you mustn't touch me. I don't belong to you. I must go to him. It's the only thing to do. These people will take me." "But it's madness," I exclaimed. She backed farther and farther from me in the little tent, gazing at me the whole time. At last she cried, "Oh, Dick, I didn't think it of you." I tried to keep calm. "Katrina," I began, "I don't know what you mean, but I tell you frankly I don't intend to let you fall into Avery's clutches." "You'd let him murder that child," she cried, "because you're too selfish." "Murder?" I repeated. "It's worse than murder," she retorted fiercely. "I'm sorry," I said, "but I don't intend—" "Dick!" She cut me short passionately. "Do you want me to tell you what I think of you?" I opened my hands weakly. "I'm sorry," I said again. She was glaring at me now with undisguised anger, her breast heaving with such indignation as I had never seen in her before. "There isn't a word for it," she said at length. Talking seemed to me to be utterly useless. She had made up her mind to sacrifice herself for your Selden, and my conduct seemed to her to be that of a selfish coward. So much at least I could read in her behaviour. But I hadn't any intention, nevertheless, of giving in. "Aren't you going?" She broke the silence. "No, Katrina," I answered. Suddenly she threw herself on her knees before me and cried, "Oh, Dick, you must go. Please go. Can't you see it's for the sake of Selin? We must rescue him somehow. If I had known before, I would have gone at once. And I don't think he can hurt me now. I can stand up against him. I know how to be strong. And after all, he's my husband." She gripped my hands fiercely. I tried to raise her up. "No," I said. She sprang away from me again and said in a low voice, "Then you're a cad, Dick." "Yes, Katrina," I said. There was another pause, and at length she asked in a calmer voice, "Why won't you let me go, Dick?" "For one thing," I said, "because I don't think it would be any use." I couldn't understand why Blanche had told her of the thing, but in any case I didn't believe for a moment that Avery would keep faith, even supposing the exchange were agreed to. "We could try," she said. "It would be too dangerous," I answered. "Are you afraid, Dick?" she asked. "Afraid for you," I said. She watched me in silence for a moment and asked, "What do you intend to do?" "Wait for him and kill him," I replied, "unless you'll come away with me." "He won't come while you're here," she said. "Then that's another reason for my waiting," I retorted. Again she came up to me and laid her hand on my arm. Her anger seemed to have melted. "Dick," she said, "I'm sorry I called you that. But really, you must leave me. I must go to him. These people can take me. They're sure to know where he is, and you see, perhaps I'll be able to get a message through. You may be able to rescue me after all." "No," I declared emphatically. "I don't intend to let you out of my sight. Blanche should never have told you," I added gruffly. Katrina's obstinacy was getting on my nerves. "But she didn't tell me," she answered. "What?" I cried. "I heard," she said. I didn't stay to ask how she had heard. I broke out hurriedly, "Well, she told me, and she told me not to tell you. She said you mustn't know of it. She wouldn't hear of what you want to do. She told me so herself. She says Selin will come back. She says other things that I don't pretend to understand, but in any case she doesn't want you to sacrifice yourself like this. You mustn't do it. Really, you mustn't." Katrina caught me by the shoulders. "But, Dick," she said, "is that true? I thought Blanche didn't tell me because—" She broke off with a cry. "Oh, Dick, then I needn't go back to him?" She pressed herself to my breast, looking questioningly up into my face, and repeated, "I needn't go back to him?" "Of course not," I said. Her body went limp, and she sank down on the bedding, and burying her face in her arms, sobbed with relief. And I didn't realize till that moment the utter fear and loathing she felt for the fellow. I didn't dare touch her, so humbled did I feel as the meaning of her sacrifice dawned slowly upon me. "You must come back with me," I urged her gently. She rose, and wiping away her tears, smiled up at me. Then, leaning on my arm, she followed me from the tent. The gypsies watched us in silence as we walked away from the encampment. "I didn't think they would have betrayed me," said Katrina. "Thank God they did," I exclaimed, and turning, I scattered what coin I had about me into their midst. There was a sudden clamour as they fell to gathering the bounty. It was some minutes later that Katrina said thoughtfully, "Avery must be losing his power." "Yes," I replied. "Last time I left you behind." "Ah," she said, glancing quickly at me, "but I didn't mean that." I drove her back to Hinton Hall. Blanche didn't seem to have discovered her absence. Nothing appeared to have changed, and once again I returned to Chalk Ridge alone. Saying good-bye to Katrina, I asked her how she had found out about Avery's ultimatum. She shook her head and said, "Oh, I had just heard." Before I could speak again, she added, "It was silly of me, prying, you know, and Blanche is commander-in-chief of this campaign. I'll remember that in future." As the car moved off, she said, "And you remember it too." Chapter 10. I heard occasionally from Katrina. She seemed as puzzled as I had been at Blanche's strange behaviour. She half hinted that it might be well if I came back to Hinton Hall to keep watch over things. I wrote and said I would go at a word, but she answered that, after all, she didn't think Blanche wanted me there. For herself, she said I knew well enough whether she wanted me or not, But now it was rather a matter of prudence than desire. I felt she was right. It was hard enough to bear the separation from her, even at such a distance, but it would have been far worse to have had her daily company, with the knowledge galling me that she wasn't mine, that perhaps she never would be mine. For I knew that until Avery were dead, without any possibility of doubt, she would never consider herself free. I began to wonder whether Avery could ever be dead without any possibility of doubt. It seemed to me that he had the power of rising from the grave at will, and I told myself that if he knew he were to die, he would vanish to some unknown corner of the world, so that we should never know what had become of him. I had given up all idea now of trusting in the official account of his death, and even in the investigations which the doctor said had been made into the matter. The bare and barren grave took on a new significance for me. The evil that poisoned the earth from flowering wasn't merely the body that lay buried there, but rather the unholy mystery of its resurrection that polluted the very soil into sterility. I found myself seriously believing the fantastic notion, and made no struggle to free myself from such distempered imaginings. Katrina's letters became more frequent. Sometimes I received 2 a day. They were really notes telling me of the state of affairs at Hinton. More than once I nearly made up my mind to drive over and risk Blanche's displeasure. As far as I could make out, the girl was killing herself slowly by the merciless strain she was putting on her nervous powers. And Katrina, too, betrayed signs of uneasiness which I didn't like. She said little enough about herself, but I thought I could read between the lines more than a suggestion of shadowing fear. Once she referred to the time when I had slept outside her door. Her words were, "I should feel so safe, Dick, if you were there now." But she added, "That's silly, isn't it?" And another time there was a reference to my strength, quite in her old manner. It sent my memory back to her as she had been when I had known her first. "I love strong things," I could almost hear her saying, and I thought of how well she had been framed in those days with the great hounds and the huge figure of old Jock. Now she seemed pitiably defenceless, and if she had let fall a single word that I could have construed into a summons, I would have been with her without delay. Sometimes I half wondered why I never heard of Dr. Dale now. As far as I could make out, he didn't seem to be stirring a finger in the matter of his escaped lunatic. I couldn't quite make up my mind to call him at St. Jude's. For one thing, I didn't like the place, and then I didn't know how he would receive me. He seemed to have been pretty well shaken by the whole episode, and by what I could gather, he had been having a bad time before we had had so much as a hint of Avery's being alive. Then he had rushed off early in the morning after the disappearance of her salon. Evidently he wanted to wash his hands of the whole thing. I called to mind how he had tried to shake me off when I had questioned him on the meaning of the affair. His wild behavior settled me in the conviction that he had had as much as he could bear, and wouldn't be much use to me. So the days wore on, and nothing happened. It was one evening that I noticed from my window that there were no caravans in Morton's dingle. At least, as far as I could make out in the dimness of the twilight, there was nothing there. I was dressing for dinner at the time, so I decided I would take a stroll that way after dinner to make certain. I remembered that once before, with the disappearance of the gypsies, Avery had disappeared too. I wondered whether history would repeat itself. My thoughts on the matter were very idle, for it wasn't until halfway through dinner that I remembered how the gypsies had betrayed Katrina's presence to me. If they were still in alliance with Avery, they wouldn't have been likely to have done that. Then, without any connection that I could trace, there came into my mind the sudden phrase, "The cuckoos are flying north." I sprang up from the table, leaving my dinner unfinished, and rushed off to the dingle to see if the gypsies had really gone. The place was completely deserted. I strode back home in a fever of excitement. What I was busy telling myself was that Avery was in hiding in his hut in the mountains. I couldn't understand why I had never thought of that before. Perhaps it was the sense of his being in the neighborhood that had kept the thought from me. But now I was convinced that he was working his schemes from his mountain retreat. I would go at once and hunt him out and settle him forever. I didn't waste time over any elaborate preparations. I made sure that I had my revolver with me and a supply of ammunition. Also, I fired a couple of rounds to satisfy myself that the weapon was in working order. Then I drove away into the night. I needn't describe that journey in detail. At first my excitement kept me alertly awake, but with the coming of the day I began to feel the want of sleep. Still I pressed on, though towards noon I felt stupidly drowsy, and more than once must have nodded at the wheel, for with a jerk I seemed to come back to consciousness to find myself nearly into a cart or a wall. Eventually I drew up, wondering what I had better do, for I felt I should never get to my destination in this way. But in a moment I was sound asleep, and woke later with a start to find it was evening. There was a strange dizziness in my head, and somehow I didn't feel master of myself. Mechanically I set the engine going and drove on. It seemed to me now that the affair wasn't in my hands. I knew I ought to put up for the night and set out fresh again the next morning, but I couldn't make up my mind to break the journey. The car was running so beautifully that it seemed easier just to let it run. And besides, I was getting to the edge of civilization now. I should soon be on the slopes that led to the mountain of the mysterious hut. Dimly I was surprised at myself for knowing the way so well. I never had to hesitate at a turning. The car seemed to be like a living thing that knew the path by instinct. The night gathered round me, but I made no halt. I switched on the headlights and drove on into the dark. The purring of the car was like the undercurrent of a dream. In fact, I seemed to be in a land of dream, unreal, fantastic, yet perfectly familiar. Through the long night I climbed steadily. There was never a break in the monotony of the journey, and the sense of dreamlike unreality became more oppressive than ever. But I made no struggle against it. I yielded to the fancy that I was being guided on my way. There was a presence about me, even controlling the car, and impelling it onward. Then, slowly, a strange thought seemed to be forming itself in my mind. There was a dim stirring of memory that I couldn't quite understand. I seemed to be living over again some age-old experience. Somewhere or other in the remote past I had been drawn forward in just such a way. There was a voice, too, trying to make itself heard. It sounded very faint and distant, and yet I could feel a kind of warning in it. Suddenly it was all clear. It was Gaveston saying, "Dick, take care." With a start of fright, I realized what the memory was which had been stirring in the depths of my mind. It was in just such a way that I had been lured at school to leave my bed and set out on an aimless wandering. For a moment I had the intention of stopping the car and turning back, but the thought came to me that the analogy was all wrong. I hadn't set out on an aimless wandering, nor had I been compelled to it against my will. I pressed down the accelerator again. It was merely the want of sleep, I told myself, which had made the journey seem hazy and fantastic, and it was the loneliness of the night around me which had given me that old impression of being lured on to some enterprise against my will. I knew perfectly well what I was doing. It wasn't Avery who was drawing me into the net. It was of my own will and purpose that I was on his track to hunt him down. And yet, at times during the night, as my drowsiness got the better of me, I had the feeling more than once that Avery was leading me on to some trap he had prepared for me. "Dick, take care," I heard Gaveston repeat. "Very well," I said to myself, "I'll take care." I fingered my revolver. Even if it were by Avery's will and not by my own that I was seeking him out, I told myself that the end would be the same. The air was hazy with the coming of the morning when I reached the hollow by the wayside where I had once before hidden the car. With a feeling of grim satisfaction as the adventure seemed to be closing in, I drew up under cover. Then, making sure that I had my weapon handy, I set off up the slope. When I reached the top and looked across the misty valley, I could just distinguish the witch-like tree standing up darkly against the rim of grey light that lay along the farther ridge. Almost without a pause, I was climbing down towards the valley, and was soon groping in a blanket of mist that rose about me from the little stream that I could hear chattering beneath. Reaching it, I made for the fall, and began the ascent. As I rose out of the mist, I found the air already much brighter about me. The tree above me was clear enough against the sky. For a moment I thought I saw a figure moving. I stopped to watch, but it must have been a delusion. I climbed on again. I moved with greater caution as I drew nearer the old tree. Sometimes I paused to listen, but I couldn't hear a sound. I thought there was a thin curl of smoke coming from behind the rocks, but I couldn't be certain. At last I reached the tree, and creeping round to the 3 steps, was quickly tiptoeing through the narrow passage that led into the enclosure. Descending the stairway at the end, I put my head around the rock, not knowing in the least what to expect, but my heart thumped with excitement as I saw a gypsy tent standing where the hut had been. There was a little fire smouldering dully, as though it were being left to burn itself out. All around lay fragments of charred and sodden wood and other indescribable refuse. The remains of the hut, I told myself, remembering the explosion. But all that was merely a fleeting thought. My mind was fixed on that tent. Who was inside it? Was it really Avery? And was Ursalon with him? I crept up to it with infinite caution, still hesitant and uncertain. Then I heard a distinct sound from within. That settled me. I strode up to the crazy tent and flung aside the curtain. It was some minutes before I recognized the ragged youth I saw there as Caspar. He was eating his breakfast, but at the sight of me he stopped with the bowl half raised to his lips. Then he rose slowly, and suddenly, seeming to recognize me, began gesticulating wildly. I didn't know what on earth he meant. I was too dazed to try to understand. It suddenly seemed to me that I had been finely fooled. I had been looking for Avery, and I had found this dumb lout instead. I thought he had been done away with long ago. I even said to him, "I thought you were dead." He shook his head vigorously, and I laughed at the energetic denial. "Oh, well," I muttered, and turned away. It was quite clear to me that Avery wasn't there. I began to understand what had happened. But Caspar caught me by the arm. There was something he was trying to tell me in his inexplicable dumb show. I watched him for a moment and shook my head. "If you can tell me where Avery is," I said wearily, "I should be infinitely obliged." To tell the truth, the shock of disappointment had brought on a heavy weight of sleepiness. I didn't quite know what I was saying. "Has he been here?" I asked, though knowing quite well what the answer would be. He shook his head. I began to move away, and he followed. But he blocked the passage out before I could reach it, and went through an elaborate pantomime. I was too tired and spiritless to interrupt him, and indeed, at last, some kind of comprehension began to dawn upon me. His acting must have been pretty clever, because in spite of myself I knew what he was trying to tell me was that Avery had never returned to the hut, that he, Caspar, had waited for him there. I had the impression of years passing over while he waited. It seemed, too, that his intention was murder. He pointed significantly to the yawning chasm, which I noticed now for the first time, down which Avery had once been thrown. But it didn't interest me. I pushed past him and made my way out. Dimly, as I clambered back on my trail, I was aware of Caspar following me. It was well for me that he did so, for when I reached the hollow in the rock, the car was gone. It was Caspar who guided me during 2 terrible days of racking anxiety over the mountainous tracks back to civilization. Without him, I should have been lost, for my mind had become utterly fogged. I don't think it was merely the need of sleep which made me stumble blindly forward without knowing where in the least I was going. There was some evil influence at work, stupefying my wits. I couldn't think, I couldn't reason. I don't know to this day where I slept, nor whether I ate a morsel of food during the whole journey. All I am certain of is that Caspar must have led me by a quicker path than the road I had taken. But it was rough, and my boots weren't made for mountaineering. I remember how bruised and weary my feet were, and that's about the only physical distress I do remember. As a matter of fact, it was a kind of relief to me, for it kept my mind away from the terrible fear that was torturing me. Avery had fooled me. I knew that well enough, in spite of my bemused brain. He had got me out of the way so that he could carry out his devilries undisturbed. All Katrina's hints of danger crowded back upon me. I could see now that she had been menaced all the while by some lurking evil, but hadn't told me of it. I ought to have stayed at Hinton Hall. Blanche was too intent on her own schemings to know what was happening to Katrina, and what might have happened to her during my absence I didn't dare guess. But I knew that Avery must have been at his old games again. Failing to win the girl by holding her Ellen as a hostage, he had turned back to his earlier method. I had a frightful picture in my mind of Katrina's sufferings. I could see her struggling against the strangling madness which Avery knew so well how to coil about her. Perhaps she had even fallen a prey to it, and was back in his power once again. Well, it was a relief from such nightmare thoughts as these to feel the dragging pains at my feet, holding my mind down to my own physical misery. It was wonderful to be in a train once more, and to feel I had touched civilization. Whether the journey were fast or slow, I didn't know, for I was in a deep sleep as soon as I was settled in the carriage. Mechanically, I got out at Chalk Ridge, though I should have gone straight on to Little Hindon. I was at home before I realized what I had done. Then I seemed to wake up. The first thing I noticed was that Caspar had vanished. I didn't even know whether he had got into the train with me. However, that didn't matter now. I changed my clothes, attended to my damaged feet, and feeling generally refreshed, got out my motorcycle ready to set off to Hinton Hall. A telegram was brought to me before I started. It had come 2 days ago, I was told. It was an urgent message from Katrina for me to come to her at once. I was almost insane with anxiety as at last, in the failing light, I raced up the drive at Hinton Hall. I flung the cycle from me, leapt up the steps, and began hammering wildly at the door. It was opened to me almost immediately, and I burst in. Katrina came running towards me. "Oh, Dick!" she cried. "Why didn't you come?" I was too relieved to say a word. I felt faint and weak with a sudden revulsion of feeling. I swayed and fell forward towards her. She steadied me, asking, "What's the matter, Dick?" I pulled myself together. "Is all well?" I asked. "Oh, it's been terrible!" she cried. "Terrible!" I suddenly drew her to me and looked into her eyes. But the hall was dusky with evening, and I couldn't be certain. But what I thought I had seen in them was that leaden shadow of storm dulling their beautiful blue. "Katrina!" I exclaimed. "He's been trying—" "If you had been here," was all she said. "But you beat him," I answered. "It was Blanche," she said. "Oh, Dick, she's splendid." "Blanche?" I repeated. "But it's tired her, Dick," she went on. "I'm frightened. I don't know what's happening. She looks as if she could just lie down and die. You know, as I might lie down and sleep, like that." "Where is she?" I asked. "In the chapel, I expect," she replied. "She seems to live there." "With Mrs. Waite, of course," I said. Katrina nodded. "That woman!" I exclaimed. "She looks like a ghost," Katrina said. "Look here," I cried. "I'm going to put a stop to all this." I began to move away, but Katrina caught me by the arm and said, "No, Dick," in such a terrified voice that I looked quickly at her in a startled dismay. "Why not?" I asked. "You mustn't," she said. I paused, irresolute. "Well, then," I began again, "at least I'm going to investigate and find out what's going on." I think she would have held me back, but my mind was made up. I led on to the chapel, and she followed. I made my way round to the vestry entrance, thinking that there I might see without disturbing Blanche. Once more Katrina would have interposed, but I opened the door quietly and slipped inside. She turned and left me. Only a curtain screened the chapel from me. I pulled it open the merest slit and peeped through. Immediately I saw Blanche standing up very straight in front of the altar, for the 2 candles were lit, drawing my attention to them at once. But it wasn't easy to make out much else in the dim light. A little way down the aisle I could distinguish Mrs. Waite, who was seated facing Blanche. The light from the high windows caught her open eyes, making them stare glassily. They seemed fixed on me, and I half dropped the curtain to hide them away. The whole picture seemed spectral and ghostly. There wasn't a sound or a movement. The dim columns, faintly luminous in the twilight, the marble monuments of the dead, and the heavy black shadow of Blanche thrown down the chapel by the candlelight seemed a fitting frame to those motionless figures. Presently I noticed Blanche was moving her arms in a slow rhythmic swaying. It was the huge waving shadows in the roof that I saw first, and then I heard a faint stirring at the far end of the chapel. Straining my eyes into the dusk, I caught the glimmer of a moving figure. It seemed to be advancing slowly up the aisle. Almost before I realized, it was so near it had passed Mrs. Waite. I gazed at it, fascinated, as it advanced towards Blanche. Then, with a sickening fear, I understood. It was a little squat thing, covered entirely in a black cloak. There was a mask over its face. It moved forward with a swaying lurch, for its arms reached to the ground, and it swung itself along on its knuckles. It was Avery. It seemed to have its face raised to Blanche, who, for her part, was gazing intently down at it. She took a step forward, and I heard her say very quietly, "Olave?" Suddenly there was a frenzied scream, and the creature seemed to be taken with a paroxysm. It clutched at its throat and fell to the floor, writhing horribly. Blanche stepped quickly forward and stood staring down at it. Mrs. Waite, I just noticed, was stirring uneasily. Then I turned away in disgust, listening to the strangled moans of the wretched thing as it rolled and struggled on the floor. What it meant I didn't know, unless Blanche were just mesmerizing the creature by sheer force of will, but I didn't think that was possible with such an adversary as Avery. Two pictures seemed to mingle themselves in my mind with what I had just seen. Blanche as Beatrice Cenci, staring down her betrayer, and Gaveston just before I had shot him, wrestling against his madness. I didn't venture to look again till the sounds of struggling had subsided. Then once more I drew aside the curtain and peeped through. I could scarcely believe my eyes. Blanche was on her knees before the hideous thing, clasping it in her arms. The mask had been half torn from its face during the mad fit, and the cloak was hanging about it in shredded tatters. It was enough to show me something of the twisted deformity of the abominable thing beneath, and Blanche was hugging it in a passionate embrace. Presently she drew away and slowly rose to her feet. I gazed in sudden stupefaction at the creature's breast, for the cloak hung open, and the light of the altar candles fell full upon it. Distinctly I could see the tattooed sign of the sword and serpent. Then the thing began slowly moving my way. I think it was only the extremity of my fear that held me to the spot, but my alarm subsided only to give place to a stupefied amazement, for it had turned aside to Olave's tomb. It lurched on to the graven slab and slowly began to sink into the earth. But suddenly its madness seemed to come upon it again. With a shrill scream it caught at the floor and would have swung itself out of the black hole into which it was sinking. But Blanche stepped swiftly up to it and glared down at the struggling thing. They were only a couple of yards from me, and I could see the whole drama. The creature made one desperate effort to break the spell that was overpowering it. Seizing its mask, it tore it off, that so its hideousness might frighten Blanche away. I would have run screaming from the place had I not been fascinated by the thing's eyes. They were jet black, and though the rest of the face was utterly unrecognizable, yet the eyes were the eyes of Avery. And still Blanche stood above it, staring it down. Its struggling slackened. It seemed to shrink and quail before her eyes, and shuddering sank back into the darkness. And the heavy marble block came sliding over the place, while a thin, lost cry seemed to vibrate like an echo from another world. For a moment Blanche stood there silent and motionless. Then suddenly she broke into a cruel, hard laughter, but checking herself abruptly, she threw her arms across her face and flung herself down against the tomb, sobbing terribly. I hesitated whether to go to her or not. Something of the enormity of her deed had made itself clear to my appalled understanding. She had called back Olave's spirit to wrestle with the evil thing that had usurped his derelict body, only to send him wandering again when his victory was complete. Well, she had done right, I thought. Such a thing couldn't be allowed to live, whether it were Olave or Avery. But it seemed to me best to leave her alone with her bitter triumph. It would have been cruel to have thrust myself upon her at such a time. I gave her one last look. She was kneeling silently with her arms flung over the tomb and her face pressed to the cold stone. Quietly I left her and went back to the house. And there I found Katrina with your Selin. She had come upon him, she said, outside the chapel. The boy didn't seem to know what had been happening to him. He was sleepy and fretful, so I sent for his nurse and had him packed off to bed. Katrina wanted to know what had happened. I thought it best to tell her the truth as far as I knew it. I told her all I had seen. For a long while we sat in silence. I heard a step outside. I thought it must be Blanche. I opened the door. It was Mrs. Waite, dragging herself painfully up the stairs. That made me feel uneasy for Blanche. I went back to the chapel. She was kneeling as I had left her. I went up to her and touched her shoulder. She was dead. It was a year later that Katrina and I were married. The ceremony in that ghost-haunted chapel was more of an agony than a delight. The knowledge of the tragic contents of the tomb at my side took all the glory from the music. It was with a sense of throwing off an ugly disease that I left the chapel, never to enter it again. End of section 11. End of The Shadowy Thing by H.B. Drake. Read by Thomas Copeland.